for the past 66 years is an experiment. The application of a program that has associated with it a certain promise. And that promise is that it can tackle the fundamental human problem, which Karl Marx diagnosed as alienation. However, according to André Gide, and according to many others of similar testimony, the Soviet Union has not been able to solve the problem of human alienation, nor have other communist states in the world today. Let's look a bit more closely at the different types of alienation that we talked about this morning, and how it is that the communist governments have failed to really address the problems, failed to solve them, and generally speaking, just made things worse. Marx talked about the alienation of the laborer from the product of his labor, and said that in a capitalist society, this very intimate and important relationship between the labor and what he produces is broken. But can we say that the Soviet worker, for example, is the owner or the proprietor or the possessor of what he produces? In fact, it's not the case. What we find in general, where Marxism-Leninism is applied, is that a new elite has emerged. And this new elite is the proprietor not only of the means of production, but of the entire infrastructure of the country, of the military apparatus, of the political apparatus, and even of the ideology itself. Marx coined the word capitalism, and used the word capitalism, which has now become a very standard item of our vocabulary. And usually we use capitalism to refer to the system of free enterprise. But in a strict sense, when Marx talked about capitalism, he was referring to a society in which a small group of people own everything and do nothing, and a large group of people do everything and own nothing. And I don't believe that we can find exactly that anywhere in the world today. However, probably the closest thing that we can find to it is the Soviet system itself, where the large number of people who are responsible for all the productive activities are not the owners of anything, at least not the owners of the means of production, and the small group of people who do control everything don't seem to be able to do anything productive. In spite of the fact that there is a well-to-do elite, in general, the Soviet Union and other communist systems are more characterized by poverty than by prosperity. There are many texts that attest to this fact. In this text, called USSR in Crisis, Marshall Goldman, the Associate Director of Russian Research Center at Harvard University, speaks about the impoverishment of the Soviet Union today. He points out that Russia was formerly the world's greatest exporter of grain, wheat in particular, and that the world's greatest exporter of grain is now an importer of grain under the communist system. Furthermore, Goldman looks at various indicators of economic prosperity, such as the growth rate in the GNP, which is the top column in this chart. And he points out that since 1950, the growth rate of the GNP, even according to the Soviet official figures, is constantly declining, meaning that that society is becoming less and less prosperous as time goes by. The impoverishment of the system, the official system, the Marxist system, has forced the development of an underground free market system, or an underground capitalism, in which most of the citizens participate. This means that most of the citizens are actually criminals, according to the law books, because they're engaged in criminal activities such as buying and selling and producing goods, all of which is forbidden because it's exploitation, according to that Marxist system. In a recent article in Forbes magazine, as Tom was talking about this morning, authors Lawrence Menard and James Michaels point out that the average estimated subsistence wage for a worker to support himself and his family is 210 rubles a month. But the average take-home pay turns out to be 171 rubles per month. That means that the average worker cannot support himself and his family on his official wage, participating in the official Marxist economy. So instead, he has to have another job or some other sort of income by engaging in the underground capitalist economy. this gives rise to an amusing, contradictory type of situation. There's a story about some workers from the West who visited the Soviet Union, and they were talking with some Soviet workers. And one of them was an American, and the Soviet worker asked him, "How much money do you make in a week?" And the American said, "Well, I make $200 a week." And the Soviet asked, "Well, how much do you actually need just in order to survive?" And the American said, "Well, I need $50. Probably, I suppose, I can survive on $50 a week." And the Soviet worker was just astonished. And he said, "Well, what do you do with all that extra money?" And the American said, "Well, in my country, we don't usually ask that kind of question of a complete stranger." And then he asked the Soviet, "And how much do you make a week?" And the Soviet said, "Well, I make 50 rubles a week." And he said, "And how much do you absolutely need in order to survive?" And he said, "Well, I need 200 rubles a week." And he said, well, the American was astonished. He said, "Well, where do you get all that extra money?" And the Soviet said, "Well, in my country, we don't usually ask that kind of question." The fact is that most workers have to engage in some sort of free enterprise activity in order to supplement their official wage. It's interesting to note that in the Soviet Union, the ratio of the foreman's wage to an ordinary worker's wage is a larger multiple than you would find in the same case in the West, in the United States, for example. Thus, we find that the application of Marx's principles, at least as best as they've been applied by any of the countries that use them, has been unable to solve what Marx called the alienation of the worker from the product of his labor, but instead seems merely to aggravate that problem and cause general inefficiency and general impoverishment. Marx also spoke about the alienation of the labor from his labor itself, his actual working process. Then can we say that a worker such as the Soviet worker derives joy and satisfaction from his work? It doesn't appear that that's the case. And we hear that, in fact, that the Soviet economy couldn't be sustained without forced labor. People are always constantly encouraged to work, and they're offered grim alternatives if they don't cooperate. In the same article, in the Forbes magazine, and also in other accounts, we hear of the quota system. That is, the central planning mechanism which determines how much raw materials a given industry can receive and how many articles they have to produce. And generally, these quotas become meaningless after a short period of time. It's considered a treasonous activity not to fulfill your quota, so it's necessary always to report that the quota is fulfilled, even if it hasn't been. And this produces an incredible detachment and lethargy among the working population. There's even a saying that Menard and Michaels talk about, a slogan in Russia that goes, "They pretend to pay us and we pretend to work," describing the relationship of the worker with the state as employer. Furthermore, in a recent report released by the Soviet Academy of Sciences, the Academy themselves admit that even while the Soviet economic problems were being blamed on various factors, such as lagging investment, flagging work discipline, harder mining conditions, 4 years in agriculture, the Academy says that instead the underlying cause, quote, lies in the outdated nature of the system of organization and economic management, or simply in the inability of the system to ensure complete and efficient utilization of the workers and of the intellectual potential of the society. The system itself does not seem to be able to utilize the human potential to bring about prosperity. A number of Soviet dissidents have reported that the workers in general are in rebellion against the system and use every opportunity that they have to sabotage the factory or the industry that they're working in. Furthermore, the system does not permit any sort of expression of labor dissatisfaction. In what was supposed to be the worker's state, the worker finds himself unable to express any kind of dissatisfaction with the situation. And once again, we conclude that if we're going to speak about the alienation of the laborer from his labor, we're going to find the worst kind of alienation of that type under the Soviet system itself. Marx also talked about the alienation of the human species, that man is somehow separated from his true human essence. But can human beings find that true human essence through the application of Marxism-Leninism? In fact, it appears that they can. There are various reports of widespread corruption. Corruption that's worse in the communist bloc than it is in the West. For example, in his text, USSR, The Corrupt Society, former defense lawyer Konstantin Simis laments that he finds corruption from the highest echelon all the way to the bottom of society. And he says that the mere fact that everyone is forced to become a criminal and participate in the illegal capitalism just to survive has a tendency to erode the moral fiber of society. In the same Soviet Academy report that I just cited, the Academy goes on to say, the type of worker that such a system cultivates not only falls short of the needs of developed socialism, but fails to match the requirements of modern production. His common traits are low labor and productive discipline, an indifferent attitude toward work, a shoddy quality of work, social inactivity, a well-pronounced consumer mentality, and a low code of ethics. Again, the Soviet Academy appraising their own system. At the conclusion of his text, Simis writes the following, and now finishing this book, I ask myself, what next? What is the future of the country? And I answer my own question with bitterness. The Soviet government, Soviet society cannot rid itself of corruption as long as it remains Soviet. It's as simple as that. Fundamentally, the Causa view is that it's not the system that determines the behavior of people, but rather it's the inner character of man. However, we note that the Soviet system, in a sense, defies and contradicts human nature so much that it tends to breed corruption, and a man like Simis concludes that within that system there's no hope. The system has to be changed. Again, alienation of man from his human essence finds its greatest expression where the Marxist program is carried out, or there's an attempt to carry it out. Finally, Marx spoke about the alienation of man from man. But are the citizen workers of the Soviet Union able to enjoy and establish fulfilling human relationships? Sadly, it doesn't seem to be the case. It's hard to imagine free and fulfilling relationships in a society that requires constant surveillance of its citizens. Furthermore, we know an elitism and racism present in the Soviet Union. Particularly, the Soviet Union itself is the union of many republics with a great deal of racial variety. But the control is in the hands of a few Russians and Ukrainians, a very homogeneous group of leaders. The border between the Soviet Union and China is one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world, and yet it's a border between two communist nations. Thus we see that Marxism-Leninism does not have within its doctrine, the potential, the power to solve the problems of nationalism. And finally, the most eloquent testimony that could possibly be given is the mass exodus of people leaving any country that falls into the hands of communism. It's said that when the Berlin Wall was constructed, behind every worker with a shovel was a soldier with a gun. And behind every soldier with a gun was another soldier with a gun. But we know that that didn't prevent a few from coming over anyway, as this celebrated photo from Life magazine testifies. Perhaps the situation of the boat people of Vietnam is the most powerful testimony. The Vietnamese people have suffered centuries of conflict and suffering in their land, particularly in the most recent war in which the United States participated. But the Vietnamese people never abandoned their homeland until communism consolidated power. And then they began to flee. Even in boats, even at the risk of their lives, even with no guarantee that they would be welcome in whatever country they arrived at. But still they left. There are certain romantic ideas in the Western Hemisphere that perhaps the communism of Castro is somehow different. However, many reports are surfacing now, particularly the testimony of the poet Armando Valladares, who originally published his book in France, in 1979 called Castro's Prisoner. And here, this is the Spanish version, in which he tells very eloquently of his 22 years of imprisonment under Fidel Castro because he disagreed with that regime. He was finally released. At one time, he was confined to a wheelchair, but he was rehabilitated by Castro's officials in order to create a propaganda stunt, which it turned out backfired against them. And his testimony becomes another one that what is going on in Cuba is no different from other communist regimes. Again, the problem of alienation from man. We don't deny the problem. We merely point out that Marxism-Leninism offers no solution at all to the significant problem of alienation. If we look at the 66-year experiment, and we ask the simple question, does it work? The simple answer is no. In fact, the very things which seem to have inspired Marx and Engels to write their Communist Manifesto find their greatest manifestation when that program is carried out and applied. I mentioned that Marx felt that the workers in the Paris cafes seemed to be able to enjoy the most genuine human relationships. I think there's no question that most workers in the Soviet Union today would be very happy to change places with those workers in the Paris cafes in the 19th century because the problems that come when this program is applied. Why is it that Marxism cannot solve problems? People have attributed it to some kind of mismanagement, but we can't accept that as the fundamental reason. People have cited lack of leadership, one or another leader who twisted Marxist theories. However, that explanation is also unsatisfactory. And the idea that his theory has been misinterpreted and never properly applied also doesn't seem to explain why, whether we're talking about the governments of Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Kim Il-sung, Pol Pot, Castro, or a host of other communist leaders, all evidence the same problems. Therefore, we come back to a different idea, that there are fundamental, extremely serious, basic errors in the Marxist point of view, and that the application of this point of view in this program is never going to solve the human problem. So we'd like to devote a little time then to examine what we consider to be the fundamental errors of Marxism. And by looking at those errors, we can be pointed in the direction of a different worldview, a truly powerful and revolutionary worldview that can bring about a transformation and the solution of the problems which Marx and Engels tried to address. Let's look then at the four fundamental errors of Marxism. First and most basic, we point out that Marx had a false understanding of the origin and nature of the universe. Or, probably better stated, he did not have an understanding of the origin and nature of the universe. Marxism begins by denying the first cause, God, and establishing or affirming that the essence of everything is material. However, what we observe in the universe is the progressive development of organisms from lower to higher states of complexity, differentiation, and organization, finally arriving at man. This, of course, is what we can call the process of evolution in a general sense. The development of life and of organisms into higher and higher states of complexity. If we were to try to explain this process from a strictly materialistic viewpoint, we would conclude that the process should not occur. For example, if we just simply take the laws of thermodynamics and try to apply them to the universe as a closed system, what kind of interpretation would we come up with? The second law of thermodynamics talks about the quantity entropy, the quality entropy. And it says that entropy is a measurement of the randomness or disorganization of a system. And according to this second law of thermodynamics, if a system is a closed system, nothing is being added to that system, then entropy will always increase, or at least it will never decrease. In other words, the system will not, by its own, become more and more organized and more complex, but rather it'll run the other way. It will run downhill, we can say. Things run downhill by themselves. So if the universe is a closed system, and nothing is being added to it, our laws of science cannot explain the process of evolution. However, the one possible explanation is that the universe is not a closed system and that energy is constantly being added. This would be one way to explain the process of evolution. In other words, there could be a source of organizing energy, and that source could be God. What we have when we examine this particular point is a typical example of the way 20th century science supports the existence of God. We might take the position that science can never prove the existence of God, because God lies beyond the realm of science. But what we have here is very typical of 20th century scientific advances. That is, science seems to take us to the threshold of an understanding of God. Science seems to take us to the point where an understanding or a belief in God seems to be the most reasonable among various alternatives. Another case has to do with the theories of evolution. As we pointed out, Marxism is based on the theory of evolution according to Lamarck, or Lamarckism. And we mentioned that three principles of Lamarckism are that one animal or organism interacts with the environment. This brings about physiological changes, and these are passed on to the offspring. However, the studies of Mendelian genetics, show that Lamarckism is incorrect. And today, what is popularly accepted by the scientific community is the theory of Darwin. The theory of Darwin is significantly different from the theory of Lamarck. According to Darwin, a change, first of all, occurs in the reproductive mechanism, what we know today as the genetic code. Some kind of change occurs in the genetic code, and then that is expressed into a physiological change. And then, according to Darwin, natural selection runs its course. Certain individuals are selected, and they survive, and the new species come about. It's the theory of Darwin which is today being evaluated and considered by the scientific community. Whereas Lamarckism, which forms the basis of Engels and Marx's view of the origin of man, has been shown to be incorrect. In any case, Darwin himself could not respond to the question of how and why changes in the reproductive mechanism occur. And it could easily be pointed out that it may very well be the creative work of God that brings about the changes in the genetic code. That's an open question that goes beyond the limits of biological science. So once again, science can bring us to a point where an understanding of God becomes very reasonable. And far from disproving God, science seems to be the ally of a reasonable understanding of God. The strictly materialistic position seems to deny the fundamental principle of science, and that is the law of cause and effect. The idea that nothing is accidental, that anything that can be done can be reproduced. Why? Because there are basic causal principles, and that nothing just occurs by random without cause. So the universal principle of cause and effect also suggests that there must be a cause to the universe which contains all the potential for the universe itself. Engels did speculate that somehow the chaotic matter which existed in his view at the beginning of the universe already had some kind of potential in it to form human beings and ultimately to form a communist society. But he never clarified how it could be that that potential was contained within that chaotic matter. We would say it's not an adequate explanation of the cause. The cause must show precisely how the potential for human life and human society was contained in the original situation. In Marxism, the question of where man comes from is somehow irrelevant, perhaps reactionary, the kind of question that you would only pose if you were a religionist or a philosopher. But in our view, it's an extremely important question. Merely to say that matter is the essence of the universe doesn't even address the question, seems to evade the question. And the ultimate result is that God is displaced and man is put in that place. But this also eliminates any idea of absolute value. The Causa worldview takes a different approach, affirming the existence of God and the absolute value system that is based on God. If God does exist, then God must have created with a purpose and a plan and according to certain laws. And our program, if we contradict those laws, go against those laws, we're going to certainly be frustrated, whatever kind of program we bring about. If our program is in line and parallel and goes along with those basic principles, then we're going to meet with success. Marx then was ignorant of the most important being in the universe, God. Therefore, it's unreasonable that he would be able to devise a program that would solve the human situation. And that leads to the second error. With a misunderstanding of man, with a faulty explanation of what is the basic essence of man, he regarded man as a laboring being, then he comes up with a faulty diagnosis of human alienation. Probably the most important point of agreement between the Causa view and the Marxist view is that alienation does exist. Those problems are very real. The dislocation of the individual, individuals who feel that their work has no meaning, problems of interhuman relationship, they're all very significant problems. But a diagnosis of that problem has to be based on a true view of what is a human being. And without understanding what is a human being, Marx comes up with a false diagnosis of human alienation. He views man as an economic animal. But we stress that man is also a spiritual being. That is, there are the internal and external aspects of a human being, and they both need to be addressed. Whereas Marxism only observes external phenomena and denies the importance of the moral and inner values. Marx accused Feuerbach of being an idealist from the waist up. He rejected this kind of humanism that stressed human love, human beauty, trust, compassion, and these things. However, we would say that these internal values are the most important values. That is to say, human beings have a desire for truth. Continually, human beings are searching for a more comprehensive, satisfactory explanation of life in the universe. Furthermore, human beings strive after goodness and desire to do what is good. Our experiences in Latin America show us that even if we speak to terrorist groups or guerrilla groups or whatever, everyone is convinced that what they're doing is good. That what they're doing is going to bring about some good result. It's just a manifestation of the drive which a human being has to do the right thing. And probably the most important human need and value is love itself. This is something that every mother knows. That what a baby needs most are not the external physical necessities, but what the child really needs the most is the mother's love. Now this is not to deny the importance of the external aspects. Food, clothing, shelter, the other external needs of man. They're both important. But we are affirming that the internal needs are more important. And the irony is that Marxism doesn't supply either need. As Toynbee pointed out, Marxism doesn't do anything for the individual except tell him that he has to sacrifice himself for the socialist state. In the Causa worldview, the fundamental problem of alienation is not an economic problem, but is a problem in man's relationship with his Creator, man's relationship with God. Because of his alienation from God, then interhuman relationships and all sorts of relationships become upset. That fundamentally man needs to establish good, correct relationship with God. And that this separation from God, which we observe, and which affects all human relations, is fundamentally what alienation is all about. This point of view supports all forms of religious seeking for God. Of course, every religion has its own specific teaching about salvation. But all in common try to understand the Creator and try to bring man to a closer relationship with the Creator. Thus, this view supports all religious and conscientious efforts to reconcile the relationship between man and his fundamental source, the source of the original human nature. Having misunderstood the nature of man and misdiagnosed the problem of alienation, of course Marx came up with a false method for solving alienation. It's like a doctor who doesn't understand anatomy, he doesn't understand health. Naturally, he won't be able to diagnose the disease and naturally he'll come up with the wrong treatment. So Marx's view on human alienation is an economic materialistic view. Therefore, he comes up with an economic and external solution, which is the negation of private property. In fact, when it's expressed so bluntly, it almost seems ridiculous. In order to be credible, it has to be expressed in a much more complex way. However, we're going to strip away all that complexity. We're getting right down to what he said would solve the problem, and that is to get rid of division of labor and get rid of private property. An external diagnosis led him to an external treatment. But the external treatment is not the fundamental solution and doesn't solve the problem. Furthermore, Marxism is based on the materialistic dialectic. It's not based on precisely the dialectic of Hegel or the dialectic of Fichte, who preceded him, but it's rather based on Marx's own version of the dialectic, which emphasizes conflict and contradiction between elements, between thesis and antithesis. Thus, Marxism always advocates some kind of delineation of two parties and the destruction of one party by the other. But what we find is that nature shows, if we do examine nature, as Engels pretended to do, what we find is that the dialectic is not a good description of what is going on in nature. And thus, the violent process that it prescribes is not really the method for bringing about progress. For example, if we look at how an atom is formed, we know an atom comes about through the relationship of the nucleus and the electrons. In the case of a simple atom, the proton and the electron. But the relationship between proton and electron is not conflict and contradiction. The relationship between stamen and pistil that forms a seed is not conflict and contradiction. Instead, what we find generally is that there is some sort of mutual or common purpose that brings two elements together. And that based upon that purpose, there is a relationship of mutual interaction, or harmonious interaction. Or we could call it the relationship of giving and receiving. And the two elements take the part of the two positions, subject and object. Subject means the one that initiates, and object means the one that responds. So this is the general pattern of relationship. And when subject and object come together through this mutual interaction, then something new comes about. The same thing could apply to human relationships. People do not tend to relate to one another unless they perceive some kind of mutual benefit or common purpose. The various Causa seminars that we've been holding could only come about because of some perceived common purpose, some common interest in basic principles of democracy, freedom, or however much our purposes overlap, that's how productive the seminar can be. Even the relationship between God and man can be understood as a relationship which brings benefit to both. That is, brings happiness and joy to both God and man because of a common purpose of joyful, happy relationship which both have. In the Causa worldview, then, it is not the materialist dialectic that brings progress, but rather progress and development can only occur through harmonious interaction based upon mutual benefit. And finally, with these three basic problems, Marx came up with a false understanding of human history. Of course, he said that history, up until the present moment, has been a history of class struggles, and that fundamentally, that's what history is composed of. He further said that history would culminate in a final class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and as a result, socialism would come about. He predicted that socialism would give way to communism. And communism would represent the end or the goal of human history. Here we can clearly see the influence of Hegel, that history is moving towards some predestined goal. Although at least Hegel had an explanation for where that goal comes from. However, we find flaws, which we'll talk more about later, in Marx's view of history. For one, we cannot simply say that history is a history of class struggle. Perhaps if Marx had lived in this century and he had seen the two world wars which have already taken place and the Third World War, which many people feel is going on right now, perhaps he would say that those are not class struggles. And he would realize that many important conflicts have not been class conflicts. In any event, history is the record of many, many conflicts, but we can't just say that they were class conflicts. Also, we take opposition with the point that communism is the inevitable end result of history. There's no evidence to show that this is the case, and we can dispute this very strongly. What do we mean when we say communism? We can use the word in two senses, generally, at least in our Causa presentations. In one sense, it's a program, the program of Marxism-Leninism. And when it's applied, it's supposed to bring the solution of alienation. But if we consider it as a program, it's a failure. And if we consider it as an ideal, then it's nothing more than a myth, because there's no evidence to show that that's really where history is going. And finally, we cannot agree that violence is the mandate of history. Although we may feel that violence was necessary or important, we may feel that the French Revolution was an important act, or the American Revolution, or various wars of independence, that they were necessary for progress, it's important to point out that the violence itself doesn't bring about progress. And we could even imagine that the same kind of results could have come about in a peaceful way, if people would have wanted those results and cooperated and brought them about. Communism is always born in violence. And up till this point, we haven't seen that violence stop. Under Lenin, 1,000 persons per month were killed. And under Stalin, far more. At the height of his terror in 1937, in one particular instance, 30,000 officers of the Red Army were killed because Stalin perceived them to be his enemies and the enemies of the people. It's interesting that, as Tom Ward pointed out, the present leader of the Soviet Union, Yuri Andropov, obtained his first significant position with the secret police apparatus in that very year, 1937. In the Causa view, the real cause of conflict, which is present throughout history, which is present throughout the world, is an internal cause, an internal struggle going on within human beings. In other words, we take the position that many thinkers have taken, that the fundamental struggle is the struggle between virtue and vice, between good and evil. Or, we could say, between selfishness and unselfishness. And this is a key concept in the Causa view. Selfishness, or the misunderstanding of one's true benefit, is at the base of the various manifestations of evil that we find in the world. Racism, for example, comes about when one race interprets their benefit as in a narrow way and tramples down the rights of others. A war can only be brought about if one nation or one group is willing to sacrifice the benefits of others for their own. Pollution, the same thing. Even exploitation. Well, Marxism talks a great deal about exploitation, but exploitation is just another manifestation of human selfishness. And the Marxism doctrine does not have the power to change the human heart and to change the human soul. Therefore, it cannot really address the problem of exploitation. It can change the system, but the exploitation continues, generally more strict and strong and more oppressive than before. In the Causa view, then, history is moving. It is moving toward a goal. However, that is not the goal that Karl Marx devised in the 19th century. Instead, it is the original goal of the Creator, the original goal of God. And that goal is being realized through the struggle between good and evil. As good prevails over evil, history moves closer and closer to that goal. To conclude this presentation, we want to consider the consequence of ideas. And we feel and strongly affirm that the behavior of the communist states today and the various communist movements today is the result of the basic ideas which Marx formulated in the last century. Those ideas, which seem to condense a certain trend of human thought and distill and clarify the materialistic, atheistic, resentful, rebellious current of human history, all seems to be crystallized in the thinking of Marx, and that thinking, when it's applied, brings about certain results, certain practical implications. So let's consider the tenets of communism and the practical implication of those tenets. First of all, and fundamentally, as we pointed out, communism denies God. In other words, religion is no longer a personal question. It is instead a state doctrine that there is no God. But if this is the case, what is a human being? It's possible to talk about Marx's view of man as Erich Fromm has done, as Bertel Ollmann has done, exalting Marx's view of man and of the worker. But realistically, there's no philosophical basis within Marxism for any understanding of human rights or dignity, because man is simply an animal in the Marxist view. A very special animal whose essence is to labor, but nevertheless an advanced animal. Therefore, there's no fundamental basis for protecting the rights, dignity, and value of individuals. And that has an implication in practice. Furthermore, it also becomes state doctrine that man has no eternal existence, no eternal spiritual aspect. And therefore, one's actions in this life should merely benefit one in this life. There's no eternal responsibility, consequence, or implication to human activity. Furthermore, according to the Marxist view, the human essence is labor itself. But this gives rise to an extremely relative value for a human being. Marx defined a human being as one who performs social labor. Lenin defined social labor as participation in the revolution. And that allowed him to eliminate any of his enemies who didn't want to participate in the revolution, because they simply weren't human beings. Finally, the Marxist view of relationship is the materialistic dialectic. The materialistic dialectic claims that the ethics and morality which the universe teaches us is conflict itself. Through struggle, through destruction of one party by another, progress comes about. And this lends itself tremendously towards a justification for murder, revolution, and the elimination of one's enemies. In fact, it's interesting to note that each one of the components of the Marxist philosophy lends itself towards a justification for murder. When man is robbed of his dignity and of his value, when actions no longer carry any eternal implication or consequence, when the essence of a human being is just a laborer, and when the ethics is conflict itself, then murder is very easily justified and certainly very much carried out. Of course, Solzhenitsyn has estimated the death toll of communism, and as we spoke earlier, that toll is awesome, 150 million dead. Furthermore, as Tom pointed out, Solzhenitsyn has observed that, according to Lenin, the failure of the Paris Commune was that those who tried to establish the Commune did not utterly destroy their enemies and their opposition. The case of the Marxist president of Chile, Salvador Allende, has, for many communists around the world, been an illustration of the fact that you cannot consolidate power without destroying your enemies. When Allende was president of Chile, Fidel Castro urged him over and over again to quickly carry out a violent revolution, and even gave him the present of an automatic weapon to symbolize that revolution. When Allende was removed from power by a military coup, for many Marxists this was just an affirmation that you cannot establish Marxism, you cannot gain power without destroying your enemies. That's why communism has produced such an awesome death toll. Therefore, we offer in its place not just a criticism of the various points of Marxism, but a summary or a framework of a different worldview based upon the affirmation that God exists. We're not entering into a comprehensive description of God. We're not entering into a detailed theology about God, but rather the simple affirmation that there was a first cause with a purpose, with an ideal, and with all the potential to create human life and human society. This basic view, even in its simple form, has a tremendous implication. That a human being is something far more than simply an animal. That a human being is what many great religious thinkers have called a child of God. That is, a unique, total expression of the potential of the Creator. This view has great implications. If God is the parent, then every other human being is a brother and sister and has to be treated that way. This view gives a great value to the human being, the highest value to the human being. When we talk more about the free market economic system, we talk about the problems that have occurred in capitalism, problems that Marx strongly criticized. And many times these problems could have been avoided or prevented or never would have occurred if human beings would truly regard one another as children of the same parent, God. Therefore, this worldview has potentially a great deal of power if it's truly applied and practiced. Furthermore, this view stresses the eternal aspect of every human being. That man has not only the temporal, physical dimension, but another dimension, the spiritual dimension, which is the eternal dimension of human life. And this carries with it the concept of eternal consequences, or eternal responsibility. That is, one's action in this life, not just simply a matter of either ending up in heaven or hell, but more than that, that one's eternal nature and character is shaped by his behavior and his activity in this physical life. We'll talk more about that idea in the following days when we talk more about the Causa worldview. Furthermore, instead of the materialistic dialectic, we support the idea of mutual interaction. The development occurs when there's a common purpose and mutual activity, harmonious interaction. Thus, cooperation is stressed. Rather than isolating one's enemies and opponents and destroying them, this view stresses the need to form common bases, things that can be mutually agreed upon, and acting upon those common bases to bring about progress. Finally, this view stresses the freedom of the free individual human being. However, along with freedom, always comes responsibility. Up until this point, many times in human history, we find the abuse of freedom. It could be called the abuse of God's blessing. And when that freedom is abused, when those blessings are abused, then naturally there's brought suffering and tragedy into human life. Even the rise of communism itself and the continued expansion of communism can be thought of as evidence that free people are not fulfilling their responsibility. However, when that responsibility is fulfilled, then we have a great hope that a truly lasting peace can be established and a truly good and prosperous, beneficial human situation can be established. Of course, we're here. The second part of this tour is to investigate the peace movement. And we know that Marxism calls for peace. But many times what we've seen is that peace is bought at the price of something far more important. And furthermore, many times that peace is just something very temporary. And we offer these principles, and we will elaborate on them in the presentations that follow, as basic ideas which, if commonly accepted, can provide the foundation for a lasting peace. We're going to conclude this presentation now, and we'll explore in more detail some of the ideas that we've covered here, some of the basic principles of Marxism, expand on the Causa worldview in the presentations that will follow. Thank you very much.
For a cup of coffee and try to be back in by 3:30. And before you go, please push in the red button on your translator. That turns it off.
We accomplished quite a bit from the point of view of Causa Seminar, because to some extent, to a very large extent, we've painted in broad strokes what we're going to cover in this seminar. And now what we need to do is go back and examine some of the points more carefully. So in the two remaining lectures today, we'll talk about more of the points of Marx's theory and a little more detail of how Causa relates to them one by one and answers them. And then in the 2 days following, we'll go more into the Causa worldview and what it offers, and we'll also look at the Western system and some of its shortcomings. But basically, up to this point, we've gone through an overview of the content of the Causa seminar. Try to write down, please. So we'll go back at this point, and we'll look at two of those components that we talked about in the earlier presentation. We talked about the three components of Marxism being dialectical materialism, historical materialism, and the economic theories. So what we've done here is tried to present in a very summarized way a treatment of dialectical and historical materialism. Now, those of you who are familiar with this area, you know that any 50-minute presentation is going to be very sketchy. And that's in fact what we've done here, is very much condense it down and deal with some of the main points and how we respond to them and what we offer in their place. So we'll look at some of the background for Marx and how he put together his ideas. And we'll talk about basically what the dialectical, what approach is as Marx used it, and how he applied it to history. And then we'll critique some of the flaws in that. Beginning then, we note that materialism is certainly not something that was born with Karl Marx. As a matter of fact, it's a trend in philosophy that goes back to the very roots of philosophy. And we can understand that materialism is the view that matter or material or this stuff is the essence of everything. And that fundamentally, things are composed of matter or material. In particular, though, in the time of Marx, the development of science in the Renaissance and following the Renaissance, particularly the mechanics and dynamics of Isaac Newton and others, suggested a certain view of the universe. And that was that the universe was like a great machine. And if one could understand the way that machine was put together and the laws that govern the functioning of that machine, and if one could understand the nature of the component parts of that machine, then one could understand everything. You could have a complete description of the universe. In other words, mechanics in science gave rise to a mechanical type of philosophy known as mechanistic materialism. For Marx, however, mechanistic materialism was unsatisfactory. He said that it tended to fall back into idealism once again. It wasn't a really rigorous or perfect materialism. He said that there were certain problems with it. For one, if the universe is a machine, who made that machine? There's a suggestion that there's a creator or a God who made the machine. And who put that machine into motion? Who gave the first impulse? Marx said that this view tended to lapse back and was vulnerable to the arguments of Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas with regard to the prime mover or the first cause, God. Furthermore, he said that mechanistic materialism was a static view and didn't explain the way things change and develop. As we mentioned, the materialism of Feuerbach offered certain ideas and inspirations to Marx, and he used certain ideas of Feuerbach's. But eventually he called Feuerbach an idealist and said that he was simply advocating another type of religion, a religion of man. So Marx was not content with the materialism of his time, and he sought after the philosophical components of an absolute materialism, a totally rigorous materialism, which would have no recourse to God, no need to bring God or the Creator into the picture at all. And it's ironic, as we've mentioned, that he found the philosophical component to make that type of materialism in the thought of the most idealistic philosopher of all, Georg Hegel. Therefore, Marx's dialectical view is based on the view of Hegel. Now, the dialectic of Hegel comes from Fichte before him, who spoke about the process of coming to higher and higher truths. And according to Fichte, if two people disagree with each other, it's because they haven't clarified completely the issues. Therefore, they have to go through a process of clarification and come to a higher understanding. Hegel expanded on that idea and spoke of every being as a thesis, containing within itself its own contradiction, its own opposite or antithesis. And through the relation of opposition, or the contradictory relation, within this larger whole, development occurs, or the synthesis is brought about. As we've said, Marx took the Hegelian dialectic and adapted it for his purpose. Marx himself never described specific laws for his dialectical method, but it was Engels, in his texts Anti-Düring and the Dialectics of Nature, who elaborated 3 laws of the dialectic, and we'll mention those laws at this time. The first is what he called the law of interpenetration of opposites. Engels mentions this law second, but since it's more fundamental, we mention it first. This law states, as we've said, that every being is composed of 2 elements, and the fundamental relationship between those 2 elements is the relationship of contradiction. Therefore, contradiction or opposition is fundamental. Union, according to Lenin, is something transitory and temporal and secondary. The second law is the law of the transformation of quantity into quality. According to this view, every change is first of all a change in quantity. And this change in quantity comes to a certain limiting point, or nodal point. And when it reaches that point, it is abruptly transformed into a change in quality. Change in quantity is transformed, generally abruptly, into change in quality. And the final law is the law of the negation of the negation. According to this law, every being is first of all an affirmation. And this affirmation is negated to give rise to the negation. And this negation is negated again to recover the affirmation. So when the negation is negated the second time, the affirmation is recovered on a higher level of development. This law then tries to explain cyclical processes and how they bring about higher and higher development. Now, Marx mainly applied this dialectic and these laws to society. Engels used a variety of examples. But we're going to choose our own example. We're going to apply the dialectic to an example of development which seems to illustrate well these general principles. In this case, we've chosen the egg as an example. The egg could be thought of as consisting of 2 components, the embryo and the shell. So the shell would be like the thesis in the Marxist dialectic, or the affirmation, which contains within itself the antithesis. That is, it contains within itself the negation. There's something within the larger thesis which is contradictory to that thesis. And eventually, one of the 2 elements will have to destroy the other. This would seem to fit dialectical reasoning. In fact, it even seems as though the second law is operating here, because the quantity of the embryo is changing. The embryo grows. It's like a quantitative change, and it comes to a limiting point. It comes to a nodal point where the change in quantity is dramatically and rapidly transformed to a change in quality. And that is done when the egg is broken apart and the chick emerges. And then the chick eventually destroys the last vestiges of the egg, and the position of the chick is established. Furthermore, we can think of the life cycle of the chicken as an example of the negation of the negation. So in this case, the chicken represents the affirmation, and the affirmation is negated to give rise to the egg. And the egg is negated again so that you recover the affirmation, and this time on a higher level of development. So strictly speaking, this represents a more evolved chicken because it has passed through one cycle of negation of the negation. This example corresponds to a number of examples that Engels makes in his texts. Now, lest we think that this is just a school book exercise or sort of a child's play, let's see how Marx applied this very reasoning to society. How is the Marxist dialectic applied to the society, particularly to the capitalist society? According to Marx, there are 2 components. The larger thesis, which is the society itself, contains within itself a certain element which is in contradiction to that society. It contains within itself its own negation. which is the working class. The very nature of the worker is in contradiction to the society. That is, the human worker's nature, the worker species essence, is contradictory to the capitalist society in which we find him. And how does development occur? Well, there's a certain basic given in Marxism, and that is that the productive forces constantly develop. Marx did not explain what kind of internal dialectic causes the productive forces to constantly develop, and we can't imagine what it could be. But he just affirms that fundamentally and always the productive forces develop. The productive forces refer to the tools and technology which society uses in order to produce. In Marxism, then, this is the basic motor power or motive force of social change and historical progress. What is moving history forward is the constant development of tools and technology or productive forces. Now, how does this kind of development translate itself into the various kinds of social and historical change? This occurs through the operation of certain economic laws. And in particular, Marx talked about, one, the centralization of capital. That the capital and the means of production would become concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer persons. How would this be done? Well, there are a variety of ways that he said that capitalists would use in order to eliminate their competitors. That is, by lowering prices artificially, then certain competitors could be forced out of business, then the prices could be raised up again. Or, by all kinds of different techniques, the capital is going to be concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. That means that the working class is getting bigger, because people are no longer capitalists, they're losing their businesses, they're joining the working force. Furthermore, Marx predicted that more and more machinery would be introduced. And the effect of this automation is that the situation of the workers becomes more miserable, because more and more workers are out of work. Employment increases. So in this sense, the quantitative change is not in the number of workers, but it's in the misery and poverty of the workers. And finally, Marx predicted that wages would go down. That's a little surprising to people who haven't heard it before, because we're accustomed to wages going up. But yes, it is the case that Marx predicted that wages would go down and would maintain themselves at the minimum necessary level for the worker to survive and to reproduce himself. In other words, to maintain himself and his family at the minimal survival level. He predicted that this would happen, and we may mention that when he found out that it wasn't happening, he simply ignored it, and he didn't change his prediction. In fact, when he would revise his subsequent editions of Das Kapital, he would omit new revised statistics regarding workers' wages. But here we're not discussing that point, which is a question of whether he was scientific or not. Here we're talking about the application of the dialectic. And what we find is that because productive forces are developing, then according to Marx, the working class is going to get larger, and it's going to get more and more miserable. More workers, more unemployment, more poverty will bring about an acute contradiction between the working class and the capitalist society. And when that point is reached, then the workers will break apart the capitalist society and establish socialism. And ultimately, the last vestiges of capitalism will be destroyed. This then is the way that Marx applied his dialectic to an analysis of society. Now let's go back and let's look at the laws of the dialectic themselves. And let's see if those laws are an accurate description of the way development occurs. Then we'll look at the way Marx applied this dialectic to society and to history, and we'll critique that. Let's consider then the process of development. In the Marxist view, development occurs through contradiction between the thesis and the antithesis within it. And the essence of this relationship, the essence of all relationships, is contradiction. We can call this kind of relationship subject-subject. Two subject elements contradicting or opposing each other. And development can only occur through the destruction of one element or one party by the other. According to the Causa view, on the other hand, this is not the way things develop. And we've already introduced this idea. First of all, the essence of relationship, at least productive relationship, any relationship that is going to bring about development, cannot be based upon contradiction, but has to be based instead upon some kind of common purpose or mutual benefit, which brings about harmonious interaction. The nature of that interaction is that there must be subject and object elements. The subject and object relationship is what brings about development, progress, and it's through the unity of subject and object that mutual benefit or a new being is brought about. We gave the examples of an atom, of a seed. We could give many more examples, including the Causa seminar. All human relationships are basically according to this model. Relationship based on common purpose and harmonious interaction. Even the egg, which as I say we chose as an example, is really an example of subject and object relationship. The embryo is always in the position of subject. The shell is always in the position of object. There's a common purpose, and that is the development of the chick. And both elements are serving towards the development of the chick. Even after the chick hatches, the chick many times can consume the eggshell, and that eggshell itself becomes incorporated into the new being. But fundamentally, it's a subject-object relationship. This is not to deny the phenomenon of repulsion. Repulsion is basically the subject-subject relationship. When two subject elements approach each other, such as two protons come together, they experience a force of repulsion. But this is a secondary phenomenon. This is not the primary phenomenon of the universe. The primary universal phenomenon, if we really look for the lessons of nature, is the phenomenon of cooperation, mutual interaction. There has to be this secondary repulsion force. If all matter simply attracted itself, the entire universe, we can imagine, would condense down into a single point. So there has to be this kind of balance between attractive and repulsive forces. But it's only the harmonious interaction that brings about development. In the case of deer, two male deer may fight in order to claim a piece of territory. But that, again, is just an instinctual mechanism to assure that all the deer have territory and something to eat and the opportunity to reproduce. So we can see the delicate balance in the universe between attraction and repulsion. But always we find development based on common purpose. Finally, we find fault in the concept that quantitative change transforms into qualitative change. We note, for one, that the process is not necessarily abrupt, as Marx tended to suggest, but rather these kinds of changes can be gradual. Furthermore, quantity and quality can change simultaneously. We find gradual changes, gradual and simultaneous changes in the rotation of the Earth, for example, which brings about the change from night to day. Or the Earth orbiting the Sun brings about the change in seasons. Very gradual and simultaneous changes of quantity and quality. Even the egg, if the law of quantity into quality were true, then we would expect that after 21 days, contained within the shell is a giant embryo. But in fact, if we were to open that shell just before hatching, we would find that the chick was in there, fully developed, ready to emerge. In other words, it's not that quantity transformed itself abruptly into quality. It's that the development of the chick requires a very complex series of harmonious interactions on a chemical, biological level in order to bring about the development of the organism. And finally, considering the point of negation of the negation, it's very reasonable to ask for a definition of terms. What does negation mean? Does it mean the destruction of one element by the other? Or does it mean a cyclical transformation with no destruction? Here we find that when Marx is talking about the negation of capitalist society, he means the destruction of capitalist society. When he's talking about the negation of private property, he means the destruction of the system of private ownership of property. However, when Engels writes about the various negations that are found in nature, he's not talking about the destruction of one element by another. He's talking about cyclical transformations with no destruction at all. And he said that the negation of each element is a very particular process just for that particular element. In fact, he made fun of the idea that you could negate a seed by crushing it with your foot. And he said the negation of the seed is when you plant it and it produces the plant. But that's not necessarily the destruction of the seed. And for the plant, for an apple tree to produce new seeds, it doesn't have to destroy itself. So what we find, or what we seem to find here, is the use of terms to suggest a violent or an abrupt process, when actually there doesn't have to be anything violent or abrupt about these cyclical transformations. In spite of the fact that we find these serious flaws in the dialectic itself, the dialectical approach, at least as Marx used it, it is the case that Marx expanded this analysis to become an analysis of the entire historical process. And this is what is called historical materialism. Now, this is certainly one of the most powerful components of the communist ideology. That is, the materialist view of history. The claim that communism understands history, how it works, what makes it work, and where it's headed towards. So let's look at historical materialism as Marx viewed it. According to this view, history began with the primitive communal society. That is, as we've said, man evolved through the use of tools and through the use of labor. And through labor, the ape was transformed into the human being. So the first society was a society in which property was common. Property was held in common, and things were shared, and there was no selfishness, and everything was commonly owned by all. However, the continuing specialization of labor meant that people began to own their tools. And they not only began to own their tools, but according to this view, they began to own each other. They began to dominate and control one another. And thus, the first class society was born. And that was the slave society. And the slave society was formed of the ruling class or slave masters and the slaves themselves. Along with the birth of class society, according to this view, the Marxist view, we find the birth of the state, because the state is an instrument which the ruling class uses to oppress the ruled class. Furthermore, we find the birth of philosophy, which is another instrument, and religion, which is another device used to oppress the ruled. Of course, the slave masters would like to preserve the slave society forever, but they can't, because the dialectic is in operation, and eventually the slaves will revolt and will establish a feudal society, in which, of course, there are two classes using every means at their disposal. The feudal lords would like to preserve the feudal society, but the dialectic is in operation, so that eventually the feudal society is going to be overthrown by a revolution, such as, according to Marx, the French Revolution, and the capitalist society will be established. Again, the capitalist society is a class society. There are the capitalists who own everything and do nothing, and the workers who own nothing and do everything. And the capitalists will use various philosophies and various religions, and particularly they use the state to try to oppress the workers, but they can't stop the dialectic. So eventually the workers will rise up and overthrow that capitalist society, and they will establish the socialist society. In the socialist society, there is truly a majority rule, because now the workers are in control of everything. And all property becomes the common property of the workers. Of course, according to Marx, it's still necessary to maintain a state, because it's necessary to fight off the capitalist neighbors who want to drag you back into capitalism again. Also, it seems as though it's necessary to keep a strong secret police, because it's necessary to dismantle the various religions and philosophies and other reactionary elements. Of course, this is exactly what the leadership of Nicaragua, for example, is telling their people, that the capitalist world is threatening to invade them, and that's why they need to increase their armed forces to 300,000 men. At any rate, in spite of the fact that the state must become extremely strong and powerful, eventually the state is supposed to vanish, wither away, and the communist society is established. What we see here is an example of the negation of the negation. That is, society begins as an affirmation, classless communal society. And that's negated to give rise to class society, a series of successions of class societies, which are finally negated again to recover the original affirmation, the original primitive communal society. So in the communist society, it's like it was in the beginning. Everything is shared, there's no selfishness, all the means of production are commonly owned by everyone. Only difference is that it's now on the highest, most advanced level of technology. What we find here, interestingly enough, are all the elements of a false religion or a pseudo-religion. In fact, it's almost like a perverted form of Christian theology. We have a Garden of Eden situation, which is the primitive communal society, where everyone is living in innocence and happiness. And then we have a fall of man. The fall of man corresponds to the private ownership of property, the private ownership of the means of production. Once people begin to own property, then they begin to own each other, and there's just a succession of tribulation and suffering class societies. It's like a history of sin from one class society to another. Also, there's an ideal. There's heaven. There's salvation into paradise, which is the recovery of communism once again, the original human nature, the original communal human nature being expressed once again. If there's going to be salvation, there has to be a Savior. There has to be a Messiah. And in the case of Marxism, as people like the French thinker Bernard-Henri Lévy have pointed out, the Messiah is the proletariat. Without the coming of the Messiah, there's no salvation. Without the emergence of the proletariat, it's impossible to break free from the succession of class societies and go into paradise. But as Lévy notes, the proletariat is more than just the workers. The proletariat is this unified body of workers. They've been transformed by their suffering, by their exploitation. They've been molded and welded together into one brotherhood of workers. They don't have feelings of selfishness, racism, and nationalism. That's all gone. It's like a new human being has been created, the new proletariat human being, and that's the Messiah. Without that element, it's impossible to go on into the workers' paradise. Well, in spite of the fact that this particular view has inspired a series of revolutions, it still remains the fact that there are some serious problems with this view. For one thing, there is no evidence that there ever was a primitive communal society. This is complete conjecture. There's no archaeological or anthropological evidence that it's not the human nature to own property. In fact, even animals, in some cases, seem to have property and territory. It seems instead that it is the nature of man to own things, and it would be our view that there's nothing wrong with private property. As we've talked about, the problem is selfishness, not property. Furthermore, the whole view of the origin of man, which Marxist theory is based upon Lamarckism. Now, in spite of the fact that Darwin has had a hard time through the years, even though he's very much in vogue right now, it still is the case that Lamarck's theory has been discredited and Darwin's theory has been upheld, or it is being examined right now by the scientific community. That man did not become man merely through labor, merely through interaction with his environment, but that the unique being which is man seems to be a product of a higher cause, as we've already suggested or argued or pointed out. In general, we don't find any pure examples of any one of these stages. No primitive communal society, no pure feudalism, no pure slave society. Marx said that Rome was a slave society, but there may be others who would say that the more important feature of Rome was the emergence of the citizen, that Rome was a citizen society. In any case, there's no pure example of these type of societies. And in particular, we can't accept the idea that the state and philosophy and religion are just tools or instruments that the dominating class has used to dominate the lower class. We would contend instead that religion is an expression of a very fundamental nature and character of human beings, seeking after their creator. Religions were not generally invented by ruling classes, but instead they developed in the suffering and oppressed situations more often than not. And in particular, there is no capitalism as Marx described it. We've already said that we don't find a situation where one group owns everything and does nothing, another group owns nothing and does everything. In a typical mixed economy of today, we find workers. Perhaps this worker works for a company and draws a salary. But with that salary, he can buy shares of stock in that company. So is he a capitalist or is he a worker? It's not clear. Or maybe he owns his own tools and he's his own boss. Then it's even more tricky. What is he? He doesn't fit in the slot that Marx prescribed. But perhaps the most devastating critique is that the Messiah has never come. The proletariat, as Marx predicted, has never emerged. The selfless group of workers free from racism and nationalism has never appeared. And this was a practical problem that Lenin confronted in 1917. No proletariat. And it was Trotsky who said that it was necessary to wait for that proletariat to emerge. But Lenin said, couldn't wait, had to make the revolution now. So he made the revolution using an alliance of intellectuals, peasants, and soldiers who had deserted the army. In fact, the great peace movement that he launched at that time was very instrumental in seizing power. However, he certainly didn't use the proletariat, as we've referred to it. This messianic group, free from selfishness, never emerged. So, of course, there was no salvation in Russian society. There never was the transformation that Marx predicted. And the mythical ideal of communism never came about in the Soviet Union or anywhere else. It's a very serious problem. If the proletariat or the selfless, transformed new human being is not going to emerge as Marx predicted, then how is mankind going to be saved? It's not at all answered by Marx's theories. And we don't find that surprising because, again, we already spoke about serious problems, errors in the Marxist analysis. We mentioned in the previous lecture that struggle cannot be understood as merely struggle between classes. And violence is not always necessary to bring about change. We might also raise the issue that if dialectical materialism is correct, and if the dialectic is bringing about this series of societies and leading history onward, then how is it that history stops at the point of communism? Why doesn't the dialectic continue to function even after communism has been established? Marx didn't give a satisfactory answer. He did say that man would come to control the dialectic and use it for his own purposes, but it doesn't satisfactorily explain how this great fundamental universal process is going to be switched off, and history is just going to stop at the level of communism. This isn't an exhaustive list of the problems with historical materialism, nor are we saying that history doesn't show certain patterns, particularly Western history, particularly the history of Europe. It does show certain patterns and certain progressions, which we can analyze from the point of view of the Causa worldview. However, at this time, we're simply going to go ahead to our conclusion that history is not going to lead mankind to a communist utopia. Because no matter which sense of the word we use, if we consider communism a program which will bring about the end of human alienation, it doesn't work. It's a failure. And if we consider communism as an ideal, it's nothing more than a myth. It's not at all clear why random, chaotic material has this potential in it to form a communist society. We regard that historical materialism is not valid because the dialectical model that it's based on is not valid. And we've already discussed the three laws and seen that they don't explain properly how and why development occurs. And it is for that reason that we propose this kind of archetype or model for development. That development and progress can be understood in these terms. The relationship can be understood in terms of subject and object with a common purpose of development. Before concluding, let's just take a look at how we might apply this model of development to something like the human spirit. The Marxist view, of course, is that spirit is merely a function or a product of the human body. In other words, Marxists have argued that when the brain is damaged or destroyed, then the mental function stops. That's because spirit is simply the mental function. It's the function of brain cells. And therefore, when the brain is damaged, the spirit stops and is destroyed. However, that argument is not very sound, because we could create an analogy. We could make an analogy to the way a television works, for example. In this case, it's true that the image is produced by the television tube. But that's not to say that the tube itself is the source of the image. We know that in this case, the source of the image would have to be the television transmitting station. So in the same way, we can't say that the physical body is necessarily the source of mental function. And we might instead take a subject-object view regarding the two aspects of man, the physical aspect and the spiritual aspect. We might interpret then that the physical aspect is the object aspect, the spiritual aspect is the subject aspect, and those two are engaging in a relationship. That is to say that the spiritual aspect is expressing itself in the physical aspect, and the purpose is the development of the human being. That would be one way that we could apply this model of development. And as I say, we are going to elaborate more on that in the presentations that follow. In the same way, this particular model of development can fill the vacuum that is created if we knock out the Marxist dialectic. And we can apply this to understand the origin and nature of the universe, the phenomenon of alienation, which we have stressed we do not deny. We simply deny that Marx has come up with a solution for it. Then we can propose a solution to alienation, and we can expand that into a view of history. And the causal worldview does these things. That is, begins with this kind of view in place of the Marxist materialist dialectic, and using the subject-object model, deals with the same issues that Marx's ideology deals with. That's why we talk about opposing ideology with ideology, or opposing one worldview with another. And that's what we're going to continue to elaborate throughout the course of the seminar. We'll stop here, and in the final presentation of the day, we'll take a look at the Marxist economic theories. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to make just a small amendment in this afternoon's schedule. We will take a short break now and come back with William with Marx's theory of economics. And instead of going into the questions and answers, we will let you have a break from that time to freshen up and prepare for dinner, which will be in the Salon Maidon tonight, where we had the reception last night. And we have a very nice presentation tonight, a very interesting film dealing with some events in Latin America. And also then we will take questions and answers tonight. So let's just take a very short break, about 15 minutes, then come back in. We'll have a final presentation, and then let you go to freshen up.
Go ahead, the light down, please. Let me take the lights down. We, as you know, many excellent texts have been written about the free enterprise system and showing the advantages that it has over a Marxist-type system. And there are numerous very good texts and many articles coming out now in periodicals examining the problems from an economic viewpoint that the Soviet Union is having. But what we're primarily going to do in this presentation, which is the last one this afternoon, is to show how it is that the Marxist economic theories fit into that overall pattern of a philosophical weapon. In other words, something that stirs people up something that can intensify their grievances as well as their resentments and move them towards revolution. This is what we have seen right up firsthand in Latin America. This is what is being taught people in the pamphlets, propaganda pamphlets that are being distributed in Nicaragua, for example, is a stress on the various economic theories. And of course it is Marxist economic theories, particularly the theory of surplus value, that provides the basis for Lenin's theory of imperialism, which is the basis for wars of national liberation and the main thrust of communist expansion today, something that Mr. Ward is going to take up tomorrow in more detail. But here we're going to look at these two components of communist economic theories, the labor theory of value and the theory of surplus value, and see how they fit into this general idea of a weapon, a philosophical weapon to stir up and bring about the revolution. These theories find their most comprehensive elaboration in the text Das Kapital, although they are also present and mentioned in various other works of Marx. In this text, Marx talks about something which he called capitalism. And again, we have already mentioned that it's in the quotation marks here because it doesn't really correspond to what we commonly refer to as capitalism, what we mean by the free enterprise system. But he referred to something called capitalism, where there were two groups of people, workers and capitalists. And according to Marx, they cooperate together to produce the product. In particular, the worker contributes his labor, and the capitalist contributes the capital. But through the labor theory of value, and its extension to the theory of surplus value, Marx tried to show that the capitalist really doesn't contribute anything at all to the value of the product. That the entire value of every commodity comes exclusively from the labor of the worker. In return for his labor, the worker receives a wage. But that wage, according to Marx, is minimal. It's only what's necessary to pay him so that he can survive and work another day, and so that he can reproduce children who can take his place when he can't work anymore. And it's the capitalist who receives the lion's share, and that is the profit, or what Marx called the surplus value. Let's look then at the labor theory of value and see how Marx hoped to demonstrate these points. Marx began with what he called the basic building block of the economic system, the commodity. And he asked the question, what is a commodity? And determined that a commodity had to be produced for the purpose of exchange, and that a commodity was anything which was produced for exchange. Then he argues that each commodity has two types of value. One is use value, and the other is exchange value. But according to Marx, use value is not a proper subject area for the science of economy, or political economy to discuss. Because according to Marx, use value does not embody a social relation. Or to put it another way, the use values of commodities cannot be compared, because the use value is something which is unique to the particular commodity. The use value of a pen refers to the functioning of that pen, to write. The use value of a glass refers to the function of that glass to hold water to drink on. And it's impossible to compare those two distinct use values. Therefore, according to Marx, the proper subject matter for an inquiry into the nature of economic processes, the proper subject matter is exchange values. Exchange values are what are interesting, and they are what you can compare. You can compare the exchange value of a pen with the exchange value of a glass. And how can those kind of comparisons be made? Well, Marx sought after the factor that was common to all commodities. And he determined, as the classical economists had done before him, that that common factor was labor itself. That it was labor which was the basis of exchange value, and it was labor which allowed comparisons between different commodities to be made. And he said that that labor could be measured in terms of the time period of labor which was expended to produce a commodity. In other words, the number of hours of labor that were necessary to produce a commodity. In the case of the pen, perhaps it takes 1 hour to manufacture this pen. Then the exchange value of the pen would be 1 hour of labor time. In the case of the glass, perhaps it takes 2 hours to manufacture the glass, so here the exchange value would be 2 hours. And according to this method of analysis, then the glass would be worth 2 pens. Now the value, to Marx, always refers to exchange value, not use value. And this value is equal to price. And price is equal to the number of hours that are involved in producing the commodity. Now Marx was aware that perhaps one worker in society could produce the pen in an hour, perhaps another worker required 2 hours, and another one was very ambitious and he could do it in half an hour. So he, in his discussion, he said that it was not the particular amount of time that a particular labor had to spend, but rather it was the average. It was the average number of hours necessary for all the workers in society to produce the given type of commodity. That's what would determine the value, and that's what would determine the price. The essential point really is this, that the value is already determined in the production process, and it's not determined in the market. In other words, associated with every commodity is a quality which Marx called value. And that value is determined by the amount of labor necessary to make that quantity, or that commodity. And he further said that that value expresses itself in the price, and that the price is really a measurement of that value. Now, it might seem that the theory contradicts common sense. We might go to the market, for example, and we might find a watch like this that has a price of $100. And yet, it represents perhaps 5 hours of labor. And we might find a pile of gravel that costs, let's say, $10. Maybe it's a good-sized pile of gravel. That represents 5 hours of labor. In one case, it was 5 hours of watchmaking labor, and in the other case, it was 5 hours of labor of breaking rocks. Now, if we hold strictly to what we've said so far, those two items, the pile of broken rocks and the watch, have to have the same price. So in order to reconcile the theory with common sense reality, Marx added on, in addition, something which he called the conversion of labor hours. So let's explain this point. In our example, we have a watch and we have a pile of gravel. And they both represent 5 hours of labor time. Now, how can the labor hours that were necessary to make the watch be converted so that we can arrive at the proper pricing of watch and gravel? Well, in this case, Marx would characterize breaking rocks into smaller pieces as simple and unskilled labor. And he would characterize watchmaking as complex and skilled labor. And according to Marx, complex and skilled labor requires more human effort. It requires more use of nerves and muscles and bones, dexterity, eyes, skill. Everything is more intense in complex, skilled labor. Therefore, one complex, skilled labor hour may be worth many simple, unskilled labor hours. So in our example, we might say that one intense hour making the watch is worth 10 hours just breaking rocks into gravel. Then it seems like we've solved the problem. The watch, instead of just needing 5 hours, it actually requires 50 hours. Because once we've converted those 5 hours into simple, unskilled labor hours, we come up with 50. Now, we'll note in passing, and we'll return to it, that Marx said that those kind of conversions were made in the marketplace. So in the marketplace is where people decide how intense and skilled the various forms of labor were, and that's how they make exchange. We'll come back to that point in just a few moments, because we're going to critique the labor theory of value. And the main point that we would make is simply this, that Marx equated this exchange value with price. But in fact, we know that prices are not determined prior to exchange, but are determined in the market. And we can say certain things about how the market works. We know that there are various factors which are important in the market, such as supply and demand. When there's an oversupply of something, the price tends to go down. Of course, when there's a scarcity, the price goes up. We also know that quality influences pricing. Poor quality, there may not be any kind of sale at all. Milton Friedman, in his text, Free to Choose, talks about the importance of prices in organizing economic activity. And he says that prices have three important functions. One, to transmit information. Two, to provide an incentive to adopt methods of production that are least costly and thereby use resources in the best way. And three, to distribute income. In other words, prices are important means of transmitting signals and information between the market and the productive process. This is actually how prices work and how the market works. Let's look at the market in action. The market, in its schematic sense, is where the producer meets the consumer. And the object of their relationship is the commodity itself. Furthermore, what they're interested in is the use value of the commodity. They're interested in that quality that Marx said was not the proper subject matter for an economic analysis. But that's actually what's interesting about the commodity, is its use value. However, producer and consumer perceive the use value from different perspectives. In the case of the watch, let's say that the producer required $70. He has $70 in costs invested in this watch. And he brings the watch to the market. The consumer comes to the market with $100 in his pocket, and he wants to get a good watch. Of course, he wants to pay the least possible amount for it. So the consumer comes, and he assesses the use value from the point of view of its usefulness to him. Of course, he wants a device that will tell the time, and whatever else he wants his watch to do. But he'll assess the usefulness of the watch from his point of view, and this assessment of the usefulness is what we can call the efficacy. The producer, on the other hand, at this point, is not really concerned with the ability of the watch to tell time. What's interesting to him is the ability that the watch has to return a profit to him, to return something back to him in excess of his costs. So his appraisal of the potential of that watch to return profit to him can be called profitability. When the consumer's estimate of efficacy and the producer's estimate of profitability are equal, that becomes the price and a transaction is made. In this example, maybe the producer asks $85 for the watch. That way he gets a $15 profit. Meanwhile, the consumer gets the watch that he wanted, and he gets it for $15 less than he had in his pocket. Actually, I really am happy with this watch. I'm a satisfied consumer of this particular product. So in our example, an exchange is made, and the price is determined, and an exchange is made. As we know, the labor hours are not directly involved in the price setting. Of course, that's one factor that's going to influence the producer as to how much he asks. But the price itself is not a direct measure of labor hours. The consumer, in particular, is not really interested in labor hours. He's interested in the usefulness of the commodity to him. We note that these two aspects of profitability and efficacy are extremely important. Without them, there isn't really a commodity at all. If there's no profitability, for example, air and sunlight, they're very, very useful. However, there's no profitability, therefore they're not properly called commodities. And if there's no efficacy, even though there may be a tremendous amount of labor, if a product doesn't work, if this pen doesn't write, its exchange value is very, very small. These two qualities of profitability and efficacy are ignored in a Marxist economic system. But they are very important because they provide incentive to both producers and consumers. Without them, there are tremendous problems of economic stagnation, which Marxist economies are experiencing today. Let's consider a few examples. In one of the articles which I mentioned earlier, there was an account of several journalists who had gone to the Soviet Union, and they happened to visit a carpet factory. Now they noticed that carpet seemed to be in great demand, that people didn't have carpet and that they wanted it, and that this factory was producing carpet of good quality. So they wondered why the factory didn't produce more or charge a higher price, buy more raw materials and machinery, produce more, satisfy the demand, and it would seem that the business would grow and everybody would prosper. But they were told by the director of the factory that that represented exploitation and that that couldn't be done. And furthermore, they were told that even if the director wanted to expand the factory, he couldn't because he was given a quota of how much raw material, how much yarn he could receive, and a quota of how many carpets he could produce. And the authors of the article noted that it seemed as though that yarn that could have been used for carpets was being used to make overcoats that were hanging unsold in the GUM department store in Moscow. So it's just a small example of when the production process is cut off and isolated from the market, when those two factors of profitability and efficacy are ignored, the economy is not going to function well. There are a multitude of other examples. Perhaps you're aware that in the Soviet Union there are very small private plots which are used for agricultural cultivation. The rest of the land is under a collective sort of cultivation. But those private plots, which by some estimate account for less than 1% of the agricultural land, provide nearly a third of the total farm output in the country. Because there's a stimulation, there's a profitability associated with those plots. Therefore, the human resources are being used much more effectively. When the market is cut off from the production system, then there must be some other more arbitrary forms of authority. Recently, in the September 26th issue of Time magazine, Theodore White, the very well-known American journalist, returned to China and wrote an article which he called China, the Burnout of a Revolution. And he described some of the inefficiencies and problems which were experienced by China trying to apply the Marxist economic model. He talked about two systems of authority in the economy, the line authority and the block authority. And he gave an example of the line authority. Line authority ran from the central government ministries down vertically to even the very smallest factories and mines. And it produced situations such as one factory which had 4,000 workers and only one toilet. And the workers would have to line up for hours to use the toilet. But in order to build a new toilet, they needed approval from the top. And they hadn't been able to get it. So they had to go week after week, month after month with this one toilet situation. They needed approval from the State Planning Commission in Peking. Another example was the block authority or the district authority. So in this case, it meant that provincial governments did trading and marketing. In one example, in northern Jiangsu, where they raised tomatoes, they needed bamboo staves to be able to make the supports for the tomatoes. And just across the border, in another province, there was surplus bamboo. But there wasn't the proper agreement to trade that bamboo, so as a result, none of that bamboo could come over for the tomato farmers. There are endless examples of problems when the natural functioning of the free enterprises is cut off. I give one more example. It turned out that one province in China called Sichuan is so fertile that there was a phrase that said, anything grows better in Sichuan. However, things were growing so well that the top management decided that Sichuan should raise 2 crops of rice a year instead of 1. They had traditionally had a 2-crop culture, but it was rice and another crop such as wheat. And when they tried to do 2 crops of rice, they ended up with both crops failing. The people of that province went hungry, and surplus grain had to be diverted to that province. There must be endless examples of the malfunctioning of this kind of programmed or forced economy. It just doesn't seem to work as well as one in which the natural principles are allowed to run themselves. One more comment. We talked about the conversion of labor hours. But what actually happens in a Marxist economy, we talked about the price is determined by the labor hours. But what really happens in a Marxist economy is that the price determines the amount of labor hours. It's not that the labor hours determine the price. In other words, this kind of conversion that takes place in the marketplace, where one skilled complex labor hour is found to be worth 10 simple unskilled labor hours, actually the conversion is made backwards according to the price. The price is fixed, then it can be calculated how much those labor hours are worth. It's not that the labor amount determines price, It's that the price determines the so-called labor amount. There was an incident that Marshall Goldman reported where he was speaking to one of the members of the price-setting commission, the commission responsible for setting prices in the Soviet Union. And it turns out that the way that prices are set is according to prices in the capitalist countries. In other words, it's impossible to calculate the amount of labor that goes into even a simple product. Therefore, they simply look in the free market what the prices are being charged for what goods. And they use the same prices converted into rubles. So one of the journalists asked this particular minister, what are you going to do when the whole world is communized? How are you going to set prices? And he said, we'll leave one capitalist country just for that purpose. A few other points about the labor theory of value. If labor is indeed the only unique source of all value, then there could not be any commodity which was not a product of labor. However, there are commodities which, for example, you might find something in the woods. You might find a valuable stone. You might find a pearl in your oyster when you're eating oyster stew. There must be another way of understanding value so that it can be understood why those commodities have value even though they're not products of labor. And what we might point out at this time is what we've already said, looking at the market. It's use value itself, usefulness, which is the essence of commodity value. And consumers don't really care about labor hours. Consumers are interested in the usefulness of products. We won't spend more time on the labor theory of value since it really isn't taken seriously by any economist today. However, it somehow is still the basis for any Marxist economy, which they're all in the process of converting over to more free enterprise procedures. But still, we want to point out, why would Marx come up with a theory that is so at odds with common sense? And the answer goes back to his original purpose. His purpose was to make the revolution. So the communist theory is part of his overall project to bring the workers to communism. To do that, he intended to show that labor is the unique source of value. Therefore, he could create an argument to show that the worker is completely exploited, that it's his labor that's being taken away and making someone else rich. And this is really what the theory of surplus value is all about. Engels said that the two greatest achievements of Marx were to discover the mechanism of history and the theory of surplus value. And the theory of surplus value is built on the labor theory of value. The theory of surplus value intends to show how the manufacturing process works. So according to this, the product is the sum of three components. Raw materials, machinery, and labor make the product. In Das Kapital, Marx talks about shirt making. So in the case of shirt making, the raw material would be the cloth, the machinery would be the sewing machine, the labor would be the sewing itself, and of course, the product would be the shirt. So let's say that in our example here, the manufacturer has to pay $1 for the material for every shirt. And let's say that the depreciation for his sewing machine, for every shirt that he produces, is also $1. And let's say that he has to pay his workers a wage of $2 for every shirt that they produce. However, when he takes that shirt to the market, the price that he charges is $7. The sum of his costs, $1 for the raw materials, $1 for the machinery, and $2 for the sewing, is only $4. This is the kind of analysis that Marx made in Das Kapital. So there's a difference there. There's a difference of $3 per shirt. And this is what Marx called the surplus. He referred to this as the surplus. And he asked the question, where is this surplus coming from? It has to be coming from one of those three components, because those are the three components that make a product. So is it coming from the cloth? No. Marx called raw materials constant capital, or fixed capital. He said that this constant capital cannot produce a surplus. The material that you buy, it has the same value before you buy it. It has the same value when you buy it as it has when it's in the manufactured product. The value of the material has not changed at all. And no surplus value has come from that raw material. He also said, and this is a key point, that the machinery is constant capital, that the money that is invested into machinery does not generate any kind of surplus. In fact, Marx made a very arbitrary law. He said that when you buy a machine, from the time you purchase it until the time that it's put in the junk heap, that machine transfers exactly its own value to the commodities it produces. And nothing more, nothing less. In other words, as it's wearing out, it's transferring its own exchange value or price into those commodities. So in this example, perhaps the sewing machine is worth $1,000. That means that it's going to be able to make 1,000 shirts, and it's going to transfer $1 worth of value to each shirt. This is a law or a doctrine that's found in Das Kapital, that the exact value of the machinery is transmitted to the products. Therefore, machinery is constant capital. Therefore, no surplus is coming from machinery. Where does all the surplus come from then? The surplus value comes from the laborer. This is the conclusion of Marx's analysis. In other words, the laborer is really doing $5 worth of labor, but he's only getting a $2 wage. Therefore, he's producing $3 surplus value. And this is taken by the capitalist, and this is what profit is, and this is where profit comes from. In other words, profit, according to Marx, is a crime. It has to be a crime. It's robbery of the worker. It's taking the value that the worker produces and putting it in someone else's pocket who doesn't own it. That's the brilliant theory of surplus value that Engels commended Marx for. And it's based upon the labor theory of value, that only labor gives rise to value. Therefore, it must be the laborer who's producing the surplus. According to this view, profit is produced by the laborer, but it's taken by the capitalist. Therefore, the laborer is in the position of a victim, and the capitalist is the criminal. Well, Marx went so far as to give the verdict and even give the sentence, which in this case, of course, is death. As we know, this is good for stirring up a revolution. In fact, it's very successful as propaganda. And as we've examined, it's a complete failure in terms of making an economy work. It's good for sharpening and intensifying people's grievances, the feeling that people have that they've been abused, and channeling that into a violent action against the system. But really, once the system has been destroyed, these principles don't help at all to bring about prosperity or to solve any of the economic problems that that society may have to deal with. Basically, Marx's explanation of the manufacturing process holds that labor can be the only source of profit. But his fundamental mistake here is a failure to understand the nature of human creativity and the way that human creativity can be expressed into the various inventions and machines which human beings create. In other words, labor isn't the only source of profit. Certainly, machinery also can generate profit. It might even be said that raw materials themselves can be a source of profit. But at least machinery indicates, machinery represents the application of human creativity, something that Marx did not understand. He spoke about machinery from the point of view of exchange value only. Exchange value means market value means price. And he talked about depreciation. And he said that a machine depreciates exactly, its price is lost, and that whole value is given to products. But he really wasn't dealing with the more fundamental aspect, which is the use value or the function of the machine, that is, manufacturing itself. And in fact, there's no direct relationship between the machine's functioning and its price. There may be a machine which is worth nothing on the market but continues to operate, continues to generate products and generate value. Marx's view is so narrow it can't encompass that kind of event. He fundamentally ignores the idea that machinery can generate profit. But let's look at this point. How is it that machinery can produce profit? And as we've said, Marx fails to understand the creative nature of human beings. It's creativity which gives rise to value. And in particular, human creativity can be amplified through machinery. Thus, the value that's being produced can be amplified and increased. There are abundant examples. Unfortunately, in Marx's time, he didn't have the benefit of seeing some of the machinery that we can see today. Therefore, perhaps that's why he didn't understand the real nature of machinery. This is an example of a machine in the Matsushita Electric Company in Japan, which does the work which 6 people formerly did, assembling tape recorders. According to the company, those people are still working with the company. They have better jobs now than they had before. This is another machine, a truly remarkable machine used by the Honda Motor Company to weld car bodies. Climbing inside automobiles and making spot welds on the assembly line is one of the most difficult, tiring, unpleasant jobs that auto workers frequently complain about. And this machine makes that type of work unnecessary. It makes 130 welds in a car body in 45 seconds. It's a job that formerly required 30 people, 32 minutes to do. So it represents a tremendous increase in productivity in the company. Now, I don't happen to know if those 30 people got new jobs with the Honda Motor Company. I hope they did. The point is that they could have. There's no economic law that says that they would have to join the unemployed. If the company is managed in such a way that shows concern for the workers, there's absolutely no reason why they can't be relocated doing better work. So machines not only can increase productivity, but they can relieve some of the drudgery and unpleasantness in human work. There's another example that I don't have an illustration for that I just read in the newspaper a few days back. That had to do with a Ford Motor Company plant in Tennessee that was losing money, and they were going to close it. And a nearby university volunteered to do an efficiency study, and they guaranteed the Ford Motor Company that they could make that plant productive. And they had to make up for $500,000 a year losses, operating losses in that plant, and they did it. In 1 year, that plant began to completely eliminate those $500,000 losses, and it was all done through the introduction of machinery. So the entire workforce of that plant was prevented from becoming unemployed, as has happened to many U.S. auto workers, because of the creativity which machinery manifests and expresses. Fundamentally, Marx's interpretation of the way manufacturing works is an oversimplification. According to Marx, the price is already determined before the product even goes to the market, and profit is something that automatically comes back to the capitalist. But as we know, prices are determined in the market, and nothing is automatic. And that has a very important implication to any investor who puts his money up as an investment in a business. This view tends to be irresponsible as well. The way we might view the manufacturing process instead is not simply that the raw materials, the machinery, and the labor make the product, but in a more general way, capital invested into all the different things that require capital, machinery, raw materials, and so forth, together with the management force, together with the labor force, produce the product. But that product doesn't automatically return a profit. The product has to go to the market, and there it may be sold or it may not be sold. So after the most careful market examination, after the most careful calculations and designs and inventions, after the management, capital, and labor do everything they can, they still better pray before they send the product to the market, pray that somebody wants to buy it. And once it gets to the market, it may return a profit. If so, then that profit should be distributed to all those who invested their creativity to produce it. Marx talked about the great crime of the capitalist system. And according to him, that crime was to make a profit. But what we would say is that if there's a crime in the capitalist system, it's not producing a profit. There's nothing wrong with making a profit. But rather, many times there's not a fair distribution of that profit to all those individuals who have given their creativity. So the problem here is how to ensure, how to stimulate the minds and hearts of people to ensure a fair distribution of profit. At the same time, we have to recognize that there can be a loss, and everyone has to be willing to bear the burden and the consequences of that loss as well. We might put this forward as a fair model for how free enterprise can work. Of course, Marx completely ignores the idea of loss. For him, the capitalist never loses money, except when he gets put out of business by another capitalist. But basically, the capitalist is always gaining and making profit. But in fact, profit is not automatic, and loss is possible. Somebody has to put up capital. In the case of the Soviet Union, it's the state. And production is controlled, and even marketing is forced and controlled. But in the free world, there have to be public and private investors who run the risk of a loss. And that leads us to a definition or a reformulation of the concept of profit. In this view, then, profit is reward that society returns to all those who invest their creativity to increase social wealth. 2 points, then, in the profit. Profit is a reward that comes when the social wealth is increased. When society feels that it is benefited, it returns a profit to those who benefited it. Furthermore, the way that society is benefited is by human creativity, the expression of human creativity. So in this view, that's why society returns the reward. The reward, of course, is in the prices that are paid. But the consumer determines how large a price he would pay. We note that in his text, Critique of the Gotha Program, Marx wrote that in the ideal communist society, the guiding principle would be this one: from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. It sounds very nice. Many people think that this would make a lovely system. But we have to ask a couple of fundamental questions. Who's going to determine abilities? Who's going to decide who is capable of what? Who's going to decide how many hours in the day a particular individual is able to work? It's very hard to assess the abilities of an individual person. If Albert Einstein if his teachers in grade school had determined his abilities, he might have ended up doing something far different than being a scientist, because Einstein had a lot of problems in elementary school. But as it was, he was able to make tremendous contributions to the social wealth through his thought and through his activity. Furthermore, who can determine needs? In the United States, there's a great uproar. It seems that some people feel that they need a lot more than other people. Particularly professional athletes generally make more than the leaders of the country. However, who's going to dictate needs? Who's going to tell an individual precisely what it is that they need? Someone may say that a person only needs a pair of shoes to get to work, but that person may want a bicycle. And if they have a bicycle, they may feel they need an automobile. If they have an automobile, they may feel they need a helicopter. They may feel that their time is so valuable that a helicopter is a necessity for them. Who can say what are needs and what are luxuries? Who can determine that kind of point? If God is going to determine it and write it on the wall, then I suppose we could all agree. Or if we determine it for ourselves, then at least we'll be willing to live with it. But if it's a third party, and in the case of the Soviet Union, in fact it is a third party, the state, which makes those kinds of determinations, then it turns out that something that sounds very good and very poetic, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, turns out to be something that doesn't seem to fit human nature at all. It would if a human being was a machine. If a human being was a machine, then of course it's easy to determine abilities and needs. But in fact, human nature being what it is, we find that this concept goes directly against human nature. In particular, it goes against the human desire for self-improvement. We're not equating the desire for self-improvement with selfishness. Not at all. The desire for self-improvement is a very natural part of the human character. We'll talk in a moment about what we mean by selfishness. Furthermore, it ignores human motivation and human creativity. Marxism does not offer a system which corresponds to the human nature. And we need to consider the nature of human beings in order to think about what kind of system would be good. What kind of system would run parallel with what is in fact the nature of human beings. And we might note a few things. As we said, man possesses creativity, which he is stimulated to express. Furthermore, people have physical needs, physical necessities. Furthermore, there is a spiritual aspect to human life. There are a spiritual scale of values which people seek to satisfy. These things can be satisfied through relationship, and it is man's nature to act freely to fulfill his needs and desires. What kind of system are we talking about? What kind of system can provide an arena or a ground for this human nature to be expressed? Well, we're not proposing a new system, because we feel that the system of free enterprise or free market system offers opportunities for this human nature to be expressed. The problem is that the system itself has been abused. Or perhaps we should say abuse has occurred within the system. This was the abuse, to give Marx the benefit of the doubt, this was what he was crying out against. Abuse occurring within the system. But he interpreted that the problem was the system itself. Well, we offer instead the idea that the problem is in the priority of values of the individual. And here we come to what we can make a definition of selfishness, or what we can offer as a description of selfishness. We've talked about selfishness. We've said that problems grow out of selfishness, that it's a fundamental problem. But what do we mean by selfishness? We don't mean the pursuit of self-improvement. What we mean is the lack of a proper perspective in order to evaluate what will bring genuine benefit and what will not. The lack of a proper, comprehensive worldview or proper perspective brings about narrow thinking, people seeking narrow, limited, generally, usually material advantages and goals instead of broader, wider goals. And the solution that we offer for abuse and exploitation is what we can term a total value perspective, or a complete value perspective. This is the solution that Causa is working towards. We're not going to any country in Latin America or any country in the developed world and simply defending the situation as it is, the status quo, the situation that the Marxism is crying out against. No, in fact, we feel that this is a more revolutionary approach than any other. The true internal revolution, or human revolution. The system, to conclude this section on economics, the economic system of free enterprise, free initiative, seems to be a good system, seems to fit well with the human nature. The free market system seems to offer an efficient way to utilize human resources and bring about prosperity. The abuses and problems that have occurred, we feel, have occurred because of too limited a perspective, or a lack of a total value perspective. And we feel that the total value perspective can touch off and bring about an internal revolution, a truly revolutionary change. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so we're going to take a break until dinner at 7:30. Now, just outside, we have today's lectures in a nice notebook, and we also have a list of participants in the conference. You can pick them out either in French or in English on your way out. French is on your right, English is on your left as you go out that way. And dinner, again, is in a salon Minot, where we had the reception last night.
Consolidate, educate and consolidate our friends. In this case, in El Salvador, by that time we had a lot of friends. And we were working, even though our presence was not felt from the external point of view, our presence was there and very strong. We worked mainly from the United States. Most of our groups and associated groups with Causa made a lot of rallies all over the States in a moment in which to be allied with El Salvador was worse than to be allied with somebody who suffers AIDS now in the United States, or leprosy, something like that. Our groups were supporting El Salvador's causes on campuses and in every major city in the United States. So we created a lot of public opinion that eventually turned out into different groups, particularly from the truly democratic people, from the conservative side as well as the democratic side, who went to to El Salvador. And also we were guiding certain friends in El Salvador in how to proceed with the kind of wisdom that is necessary in order to have an effective action against the communism subversion and propaganda.
My name is Joel Peddle. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, USA. I represent Libertas as a writer. My question is, what is Causa's policy regarding right-wing authoritarian regimes which, from time to time, oppress, essentially? By the way, I'm in support of most of Causa's goals and very sympathetic to the crisis of communism. But once again, what response would you give to many or those in opposition to anti-communism who contend that authoritarian rightist authoritarian regimes are a greater threat or an equal threat to communist regimes?
Very crucial question, I feel. Very important question. Particularly when you go to Central and South America, the great problem of military dictatorship, authoritarian regimes, and associated with the anti-communism, but doing nothing but the corruption, corrupted government, corrupted procedures, and bureaucratic government. We Causa, the communists are very likely and love to accuse us saying that the extreme right wing Causa. And when we went to Dominican Republic, one of the left newspaper painted my picture and saying, "New face of neo-fascismo." Apparently my face, I didn't know that. I'm that kind of person. Anyway, to the point, number one, Causa is not being labeled as a right-wing movement. When we go to Central and South America, we are not even using the word anti-communism. The anti-communism is as bad as communism. We declare, Causa, the war against two enemies. Communism on one hand, corruption the other hand. We proclaim Causa worldview as a two-edged sword. With one blade, one edge, we cut the communistic ideology, shred it down to the pieces. And another edge, we cut down the corruption of our society. We are not the friend of authoritarian government. We are not the friend of corrupted government. We are not here, Causa, advocating status quo. We advocate for change, but not the change that Marxists advocate. We advocate true change. We consider that true change comes from the basis, ground floor, individual man. The Causa has a policy, instead of we have accusing fingers to others, even to communism, you will hear tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, our conclusion will be that finger at yourself. Unless we change, unless I change, unless I revolutionize myself first, there is no fundamental change, no real hope in our world. I tell you this has a tremendous appeal in a way of new wave of fighting communism. Our goal is defeat communism. Another goal, to liberate the victim of communism. This morning I studied victory over communism as a goal. However, at the same time, we Causa do not declare every communist under the sun is our enemy. No, those people, even including 180 million of Soviet Union people, Russian people, they are not our enemy. They are, in a way, a victim of communism. The false ideology, that is our enemy. The people who are suffering under the yoke of communism need our help. We are not the bloodthirsty. We are not out there to kill anybody. We can declare God is a weapon, love is a weapon, and I tell you, in Central and South America, it gives me tremendous pleasure of seeing the response of the people, top from the government, university students, and housewives. Recently, we had a very wonderful seminar in Dominican Republic, as who mentioned, Tom mentioned, or Antonio mentioned. I want to read a couple of testimony written by the participant. This will give you a flavor. What kind of work we are performing. And here suggests, for example, Luis Leonor Cruz, Santo Domingo, he wrote, "We need a spark which could awaken our dormant conscience. Perhaps we have failed to pay heed to the progress of our enemy, which in a surprise manner wants to take away our freedom and has been working tirelessly. After this seminar with Causa, we have a clear understanding of the situation and an effective weapon which gives us the confidence to fight. We are sure to win through this weapon and without violence or bloodshed. Practically, we have eliminated the fear of undertaking such a fight. The one thing, amazing thing, that the new awakening take away the fear, giving them confidence. Having learned what you have presented here, we're ready to go forward and not take even one step back. I hope that with the union and progress of these ideas, we might build and protect our country, freedom, in accord with the plan of our Creator." One other. After Causa seminar, 3 days, this man wrote, "I'm a new man today. I feel touched by divine providence. I feel happy because I have the truth. The truth has come unto me. I love even more my neighbor, my brother. I will spread with faith and love these good news, which will transform the world. The Godism in the response which I thought in the struggle against communism, it is the adequate weapon to overcome communism. Onward, victory is ours." Some kind of confidence, some euphoria is being created. This is Santica Rodriguez, Santo Domingo. This is interesting. This is a very well-learned, educated man, and he wanted to become a priest, he said. He wrote, "When you began to speak about God, I thought, well, I already know God. But after the presentation here, in this seminar, I could say that I was introduced first time to God here, that I had met him in person. If I know God, I know also myself. I come also to know my enemy, communism. I believe that if I want to succeed in building an ideal society, I should embrace the Causa worldview, grow together with this ideal, and strengthen our democratic society." This is very powerful testimony. One other person said, "It is the first time that I've listened to people speak the truth about communism without going in circles. You have told the truth. without fear. This is Causa position. We will tell the truth without fear. I feel that I have had a re-encounter with God. It is the God who has created us, and I feel is all love. There's no need to fear or be ashamed of those things which were taught to us by our teachers. My love toward God, my family, my fellow men has grown during these 3 days. Thank you for reawakening my religious conviction. This is an incredible side effect, in a way, of fringe benefit, we call it. Causa Seminario is not necessarily engender any particular religious movement, as I said this morning. But amazing things happening. All the religious adherents come to Causa Seminar going back to their own religion with a firmer conviction than before. The Catholic, the Catholic priest who spoke about in the movie, Gonzalo in Guatemala. He said, I'm going back to my country as a better priest, better Catholic, better religious. It's just amazing. I just finally want to read one more. Believe only with the stronger commitment and conviction alone can defeat communism in the end. Period. No other way. The idea must be superior. Our idea must be based on the truth. And that must be able to engender stronger commitment to our cause and our world, our values, than the communism invoked within their adherents. That's the principle. It's simple as that. It's a competition of commitment, dedication, fervor, and awakening to the new value can do this. And so it's rather prolonged answer because it's rather important to share this information with you. Joe, and thank you for your coming. It's the equally important thing that we have a power to engender the passion and the new hope among the young people. So when we go to Central and South America, first we approach intellectual leadership. Because unless you can have a power to move the intellectuals and the leadership, you cannot move the country. But then we go down to young people. Because young people are most victimized by the communism. So they are the ones who have ideal, who have fervor, who have such a passion. They want to do something about it. And so the Causa is not just talking about ideas. The Causa is becoming a movement that is a doer, doing something. And the primarily, of course, through the power of education. Thank you for listening.
My name is Álvaro Santos. I represent a weekly newspaper in Portugal. All we know that communism is growing up in free countries and in non-communist dictatorships. First, because we do nothing. Second, because of those that Lenin called, I don't know if this is the right way of saying, Chiomara Verbora, which means useful idiots. My question, and let's be practical, is this. Causa is fighting communists in free countries. Our presence here is a proof of that. My question is, what do Causa intend to do to fight communists in their own field? I mean, in the countries beyond the Iron Curtain.
At the moment, Causa is not doing anything particular within the Iron Curtain or behind the Iron Curtain. Our rationale is this. The communistic system within itself has a fallacy and contradiction to collapse itself within. I tell you, the system is not working. and some Sovietologists told me, if we leave the communist nation alone, the economy would not last more than 2 years, even less than 2 years. They have to explode within. The problem of communistic world today is the behavior of the free world, particularly leading nations such as United States, Japan, France, Germany, and England, and so forth. Because it is a lack of understanding and fear prevailing in the Western world is truly prolonging, almost sponsoring communist program today. You know, the communistic world owes the free world about $600 billion. $600 billion. They're borrowing more every day. And the free world is getting more money, more material, more technology. The Causa, at the same time, therefore, that we want to bring the new moral renaissance to the Western world first. And come up with a project such as stop the peace movement, fighting the peace movement. They initiate a project such as embargo all aid and material and scientific technology to the communist nation. These are the things that we can do it readily here, right here in our world. These will affect more quickly the destiny of the communist nation. Of course, eventually, we are concerned and our care and our target is the liberation of those people who are suffering under the yoke of communism, no question. But we have so much need to be done today in the Western world. And by doing so in a unified manner, we can suffocate the communist nation. Because that system, that economy you heard today, you know, from Mr. Lay, is not working. Why it's not working? Because it's based on assumption, lies, not on the truth. And they're at the verge of collapse. There are so many crises within their system. Without Western countries in the free world helping them, they could not survive. This is our understanding and belief. For therefore, we want to do something that we can do right away in our surrounding, in our world, in our nation. Here in Paris, for example, that's where we came to Paris. That's where we conduct this fact-finding tour. And we do many other things that is acute and important and immediate that will make an impact over the well-being and the destiny of our nation, particularly aiming at the Soviet Union. And this is where we, our Causa, feel and we're pursuing at the moment in that direction. Thank you. I hope it will satisfy your question.
Our questioner speaks only German, so friends at the table are going to help her out.
Yeah, I'm translating for Mrs. Popova. She's a Russian dissident, and she wants to do the following. I want to tell you something today, and I want to ask something. First, I want to say thank you very much. Today I'm happy and I'm sad at the same time. I am a real Russian. My historical fatherland is Russia. Why did I see myself forced to leave my historical fatherland? For 10 years I engaged in dissident politics in Moscow. I have written critical essays, and then the KGB wanted to put me into a psychiatric clinic in Moscow. For 4 years now I'm a political immigrant. I am continuing my political activities, and in this year my 73-year-old mother had been killed in the USSR. My 23-year-old daughter is kept as a hostage in Moscow. Why? Because I wrote about the Russian Holocaust that lasts already for 65 years. And I want to ask you now, is there above the Kremlin only God? And my second question, the Soviet Union and its satellites have a tremendous load of debts, over $150 billion. Who has given the money to the Soviet regime? Is my second question. The first question was, is there God? Is there only God above the Kremlin? And the second question, I think the first question shall stand for where is God beyond Kremlin? What is God doing behind the Kremlin? No? And the second question about the debts in the Soviet Union.
Tomorrow we'll speak more about the points that you raised. However, I think in a sense, your second question responds to the first question. There's not just God above the Kremlin, but finally the fact that the West, as Colonel Park already made it so clear, has supported. We know everyone's familiar with Lenin's famous phrase that we will string up the free world. And someone asked, where will you get the rope? And he said, well, the West will sell it to us. That's the tragedy. There's not just God above the Kremlin, but all of us are responsible. If the West can be awakened, if we can recognize what we are capable of doing, then as Colonel Park already said, it's only a matter of time before the Soviet Union would be crippled. For our Causa seminars, usually we have as our speaker, one of our speakers, Mr. Mikhail Makarenko, likewise a Soviet dissident. And the constant point that he makes is the Soviet people, the Russian people in general, are in the midst of a civil war against the government that's in power. And they're saying, we're not asking the West to intervene in our civil war. All we're asking you is one simple thing. Please do not help those who are oppressing us. So this, as Colonel Park said, is one project which Causa is in the process of trying to develop really an important campaign, particularly in the United States and afterwards in Europe and in Japan, to awaken people that we cannot continue just to support the Soviet Union in the way that we have before. There's a moral factor which is involved in all of this, and it's essential that we awaken and recognize that. So we appreciate your point, especially someone from Russia to say that. It only validates what we feel. Thank you.
My name is Mr. Chuang. I'm the publisher of the Student Right newspaper in Canada. I would like to come back to the question of the point of view of Causa International concerning captured nation. I think that Mr. Bolivar already answered a public question. But I wanted to know if you have any intention to do anything to help people who fight in the right way. They are fighting against communism inside the captured country like Afghanistan, like Vietnam, Cambodia. Because I think that the point of view of Causa International until now is still defensive opinion. I think that we need more offensive, because the best defensive should be an offensive. I would like to know more about that. Thank you very much.
Again, very, very acute question, very critical, important question you asked me. The Causa movement is relatively new one, as you can see. Started in 1980, but basically busy in 1981 and 82, this is 83. But we found the enormous kind of experiences that Causa can become a catalyst or umbrella to bring the unity among all 5 freedom fighters or freedom fighting organizations, particularly those captive nation champions, and those, the citizens who lost their homeland in a recent year. For example, Afghanistan is one, Vietnam is another, Laos and Cambodia. And here we have former president of Uganda. This is the proper time probably to recognize one of our champions of freedom. Would you stand up and... Mr. Dr. Finaisa, welcome. So, we truly want to pursue the slogan, united we stand, divided we fall. What is lacking in the free world today, the unified effort. The communism is international. They call themselves international communism. They come under one system, even though we recognize the division between Soviet Russia and the Red China. But basically, however, they come under one philosophy and one kind of organization internationally. Nicaragua, for example, it's not just a Nicaraguan situation. Cuba is not a Cuban situation, all related to Soviet Russia. So, what the free world is lacking is a unified effort. And in order to unify our efforts, to bring up the strong resistance and the battle against communism, we must have some umbrella, some common cause or common point. And I hope in the days to come, particularly in the year of 1984, that the Causa movement throughout the world will bring that kind of opportunity, the catalyst role, to bring the organization, those thinking and fighting, freedom-fighting people together, to putting up the common cause against the worst inhumanity we have ever seen, communism. The other day we have experiences having Nicaraguan freedom fighters in the United States. They have in Los Angeles alone, they have about 100,000 people, Nicaragua, well educated, many of them are U.S. citizens. And such as Louisiana, they have only 35 to 40,000. And New York, elsewhere, tremendous numbers. But the leaders come to me saying that the problem with Nicaragua have in the United States, we could not unite. So we cannot master our power. Then he said, we want to initiate Causa, Free Nicaragua, in the United States. Why did you say that? Why don't you, unite under the banner of Nicaraguan freedom fighter? He said, your philosophy and a worldview provides us a base upon which all the Nicaraguan everywhere can unite. I was deeply touched and moved by the statement. So, Causa is trying to provide a broad enough, yet specific enough, powerful enough commitment so that all freedom fighters in the free world today, particularly in the United States and Europe, can unite. We have a hope. We are going to do our absolute best toward that direction. And please participate. And in Canada, for example, Solidarity came to a Washington seminar. They're very all excited, doing something under the banner of Causa. So Causa coming to Europe is another dimension of Causa, adding the global dimension. So I'm very happy to be here, as you know. Thank you.
Okay, we have three questioners in line.
My name is Diego Lemos. I work for Diario Las Americas, Miami, Florida, USA. And my question is related to the one that Mr. Santos did before. I find very interesting and very appealing the concept of the idea of internal revolution. But my question is this: at this juncture, do you believe that we have time enough to stop or to defeat the communism in Latin America?
What do you think?
Time is very short. We have to fight.
All right, I agree. Time is very short, and we do have to fight. But absolutely, I feel that we can win. And we've been working down there for the past 3 years with a very good response. And we have experienced sometimes difficult moments, sometimes setbacks. However, we have found in the Latin American people a very deep faith in God, which I'm sure has helped that people sustain many attacks already. The Dominican Republic, where it's all very fresh in our minds, we just came back from there. If we look geopolitically at that country, and we look at its tumultuous history, the dictators that it's had, the bitter experiences, the kind of resentments that flow throughout that country, I personally would feel that that country would have succumbed to communism a long time ago. And if I look for one thing that has kept it going, one thing that has sustained it, I feel that a significant factor is the deep faith in God that we found there. Those are intangible things, things that one experiences in one's heart and soul and feels. But very much I feel that we're going to win in Latin America. Furthermore, I think that the leadership of the free world, the United States, for example, is more inclined to wake up to the problem, since the problem is now right at the doorstep in Central America. We've watched the threat grow closer and closer, come closer and closer, and now we are seeing signs of life in the United States, signs of an awakening and hope, and we're certainly going to do everything we can to encourage that and draw the line, fight the fight wherever it has to be fought, stop it, and turn it around the other way. So I guess I've said several times, yes, we think we can win.
Simon Anekwe, and I work for the New York Amsterdam News in New York City, but I'm a Nigerian citizen. May I preface my question with a remark about the places in Africa that were painted red and presumably are communist, like Libya and Zaire. These are, in my view, two non-communist territories on the extreme poles. Coming to my question, are you going to limit your program to a reaction to the presence of communism, communist domination? For instance, would you consider a program for Haiti, the program for the Republic of South Africa?
It's a very good question. Those two good questions. We have to have a clear understanding of evil, and understand that on the scale of evil, there are situations which are more dangerous and more threatening than other situations. Some people have noted the difference between authoritarianism and totalitarianism. There are a lot of examples of nations which were authoritarian. Colonel Park just mentioned we were recently in the Dominican Republic. As we know, they had one of the most repressive authoritarian regimes in the Western Hemisphere during the whole time of the Trujillo government. Incredible stories if I told you about how people were treated in that country. In the 1930s, one time, Trujillo decided that he wanted to eliminate all Haitians from the Dominican Republic. And overnight, in approximately 1 month, he killed 40,000 people. One of the most repressive regimes. We can't deny that fact. We do not support, as Colonel Park said, we are not a right-wing organization. However, what we do feel very much is this: authoritarian governments can turn to democracy, but because those leaders will eventually die. they can't continue indefinitely. However, communism, on the other hand, continues, perpetuates itself, and justifies its existence on the basis of an ideology. Therefore, it's even far more pernicious. Our concern about Haiti and our concern about South Africa is twofold. First of all, we are very much concerned about the social injustice which exists inside of those nations. And Causa is not going to stand up and say, we endorse and we accept the policies which exist in those nations today. No. But likewise, Causa is concerned about the destiny of those countries. These are definitely situations which can very easily be exploited by communists. In other words, we don't want to see those people, after they've already suffered so much, be exposed even to more suffering by having what existed now be the basis to justify afterwards a totalitarian regime. So, yes, I think that it's possible that we would do some work in, for example, with respect to Haiti. We've worked with some of the democratic forces in Haiti and also some of the democratic forces which are in exile in the United States. We do have some connection and some work with them because we're concerned about the future of that country. The same is true about South Africa. We would want to work on many levels to protect that country from falling into the hands of communism. But do we endorse what exists there now, or will we go and say that we endorse that? Absolutely not. But at the same time, we want to find a way to protect those nations from eventually falling into the hands of communism. So it is a responsibility not just of Causa, but of the free world, really, to think not just of their suffering today, but to prohibit further suffering. We have the classic example of Angola. Angola, a nation with 6 million people. Since the Soviet takeover of Angola, and I say Soviet, Cuban takeover, whatever we want to call it, 1 million of those 6 million people have left the country. 150,000 of them were killed. We don't want to see the same thing happen in South Africa. We don't want to see the same thing to happen in Haiti. It's the responsibility of all of us in the free world to find and to try to articulate a proper policy so that the destiny of those people can be better than their present situation, and that they can live in true equality and in true respect.
My name is Murray Steinman. I'm a writer and editor for Art Magazine in California. And I wanted to basically follow up on several questions, including the last one, but the one which started earlier, dealing with the question of authoritarian regimes. It's one thing to be able to state an ideal, and then there's another thing to actually achieve it. What I wanted to find out was a little bit about how you would actually translate your ideas into a practical program. For example, many so-called authoritarian regimes, whether right or otherwise at this point, are under pressure, if not direct aggression, from communism. In the short term, do you support the regimes even though they're corrupt? In other words, how do you oppose one and not support the other without pulling the house down?
I'd like to just go back very briefly to the point this morning that we discussed. There's always two dimensions. The one dimension is that there's been a tendency very often to expose the corruption of a given government. But the other thing we have to see is whether the forces which are trying to turn around that situation in fact offer a solution or not. If they don't offer a solution, and it seems, and not only do they not offer a solution, but from their, we'll talk about this more tomorrow as a matter of fact, but from their language, from their methodology, etc., we can situate them as being Marxist, even though they may say that they're not, but from their methodology, etc., we can situate them as being Marxist. We can't support that kind of process. But if there is really a democratic alternative which exists, then I think that it's the responsibility of the free world to try to work through diplomatic channels and other ways to help that to come about. But the idea is not just to suddenly lambast the regime, to force on the people a new government which turns out to be just as repressive as the previous government, or even more so. This is the mistake. It seems like that suddenly people jump from one country to another, to another, to another, and talk, well, once this country's communized, sometimes Colonel Park talks about the idea that the press saying, if a tree falls in the woods and the press isn't there, the tree didn't fall. So while Vietnam was still non-communist, we heard everything about all the trees that fell. But once Vietnam became communist, we didn't hear about those trees anymore. But I think it would have to be on the basis of country by country, so it's certainly impossible to say that here. It's certainly according to the situation of each country that we would be able to say something. For example, I'm trying to think of a concrete situation. Colonel Park has a more concrete situation than myself, apparently, so I'll invite him to come on. Okay.
Tom, I think your answer, the previous question, was very eloquent and good one. I'm inspired. Tom is correct. We have to deal with the country by country. In South America and Central America, there are democratic nations and authoritarian government. So let me take one example of authoritarian government. For example, Uruguay. Uruguay is under military junta. And I've been visiting Uruguay several times. And we have an incredible Causa movement going on in country Uruguay. And I become a true lover of that country. And the people are very genuine, well-educated. I mean, just simply good people, and also good government. I've never seen a government so uncorrupt, relatively speaking, of course. The government like Uruguay, even though under the military government. You know, we had some project, the Causa-related investment project. The one dear friend in government, you know, number one advice, and it come to me saying that in order for you to succeed your investment in Uruguay, don't ever try to bribe an official. Well, I told him, you're telling me and my principal. And it is incredible. The government like that, it is still attacked by the international media as authoritarian, militaristic, and so forth. But the government become a military that was democratically tradition country. Only they become a military government because of the communistic repression. In 1960, as you know very well, the first target in South America, the communists trying to take over the country of Uruguay by subversive act, what they call Tupamaro. Tupamaro is a really well-organized, communist-supported, subversive act, terrorism, the guerrilla warfare. They did that because they wanted to take that country first in order to influence the country neighboring, such as Argentina and Brazil. They failed. But in order to stop this emergency, the military has to take action. I am sympathetic to that. I'm very sympathetic to that. I rather that countries survive under military even for temporarily, instead of become a Marxist nation. That's Causa's approach. But again, then we support the government to transfer to the ultimate prosperity in the democratic system. The country had, election schedule coming up. But I can see that the government and military, no one dictator, like many other countries, ruling. Even the military is very democratic running. Every 2 years, army command has been changed. Every 4 years, the president is peacefully changed. Incredible. The country like that is one deep respect for me. And the country will eventually going back to democracy. And, where there's a white party and red party, the initiating the initial political overture. And amazing things is happening. They are not dialoguing too much. But the Causa seminar provide the party leaders of the both parties come together. We provide opportunity for dialogue and a higher sense of purpose, patriotism, and the fighting communism. They all united under that common goal. So we are providing sort of inspiration, the guidance, the direction to that country's political life, for which I'm deeply grateful. So if you criticize me while you're working with the authoritarian regime, I will take that blame, because I'm not ashamed working in a country like that. At the same time, Causa is a very successful democratic institution, democratic country such as Honduras. We paid a tremendous attention to Honduras. As you know why, because after Nicaragua, next target is going to be Honduras. But as one democratic country, I met the president you saw in the film, the Dr. Coldovar, the democratically elected president. Then we were working in Dominican Republic, which is again democratically elected president. Now we're working with the Jamaica, and the Lima, Peru, the Colombia. We had our media conference, Cartagena, Colombia. Those are the traditionally democratic countries in South America. But the important thing is that we want to give democracy true nourishment in terms of worldview. As I said this morning, democracy is not an ideology. It's a system of government. So anybody who's trying to fight communism, merely saying we have a democracy, will not work. Democracy must be backed up by the true philosophy and a worldview. And the United States, for example, democratic system functioning very well, it is my own interpretation that democracy is working in that country because the people and the tradition of culture of that country is the basic Christian. The Christian doctrine, presented from foundation upon which the democracy of the United States blossomed. That's the way I feel. So therefore I have a worry. Today in the U.S., the Christian heritage is decreasing so rapidly. It's so different compared to 10 years ago. So I have a worry because the more and more in the U.S. democratic system has a sign for fatigue and irregularity, abnormality. Because it's the base, the spiritual base and the foundation is shaking. This is just one example. For the reason, Causa's purpose is not the political movement. We are not waging any political movement. But we want to provide a democratic nation the firm philosophical worldview so that they can prosper even more or healthy. This is our goal. And I think in a short history of Causa, we have been doing that very well. Very well. So in South America and Central America, we have what they call the slogan. When we go there, they come up with a slogan. Well, after their Causa seminar, they say, God, freedom, fatherland, and democracy. Those four are the pillar upon which the Causa movement is based, in particular in Central and South America. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And I know it's a very intensive schedule today. One more tough day tomorrow. But bear with us. I think you will really experience something refreshing and genuine. We're not trying to sell ideas to the media corps. I want you to know, and as Larry so beautifully mentioned, we want to inform you, particularly tomorrow night. I want to talk a little bit about Reverend Moon. Why? Because I want to be honest. I want to hear my verdict. My